Chapter 6. Conclusion, the Religion of Humanity. Love, then, is our principle, order our basis, and progress our end. Such, as the preceding chapters have shown, is the essential character of the system of life which positivism offers for the definite acceptance of society. A system which regulates the whole course of our private and public existence, by bringing feeling, reason, and activity into permanent harmony. In this final synthesis, all essential conditions are far more perfectly fulfilled than in any other. Each special element of our nature is more fully developed, and at the same time the general working of the whole is more coherent. Greater distinctness is given to the truth that the affective element predominates in our nature. Life in all its actions and thoughts is brought under the control and inspiring charm of social sympathy. By the supremacy of the heart, the intellect, so far from being crushed, is elevated. For all its powers are consecrated to the service of the social instincts, with the purpose of strengthening their influence and directing their employment. By accepting its subordination to feeling, reason adds to its own authority. To it we look for the revelation of the laws of nature, of the established order which dictates the inevitable conditions of human life. The objective basis thus discovered for human effort reacts most beneficially on our moral nature. Forced as we are to accept it, it controls the fickleness to which our affections are liable, and acts as a direct stimulus to social sympathy. Concentrated on so high an office, the intellect will be preserved from useless digression, and will yet find a boundless field for its operations in the study of all the natural laws by which human destinies are affected, and especially those which relate to the constitution of man or of society. The fact that every subject is to be regarded from the sociological point of view, so far from discouraging even the most abstract order of speculations, adds to their logical coherence as well as to their moral value, by introducing the central principle round which alone they can be coordinated into a whole. And whilst reason is admitted to its due share of influence on human life, imagination is also strengthened and called into constant exercise. Henceforth it will assume its proper function, the idealization of truth. For the objective basis of our conceptions scientific investigation is necessary. But this basis once obtained, the constitution of our mind is far better adapted to aesthetic than to scientific study, provided always that imagination never disregard the truths of science, and degenerate into extravagance. Subject to this condition, positivism gives every encouragement to aesthetic studies, being, as they are, so closely related to its guiding principle and to its practical aim, to love namely, and to progress. Art will enter largely into the social life of the future, and will be regarded as the most pleasurable and most salutary exercise of our intellectual powers, because it leads them in the most direct manner to the culture and improvement of our moral nature. Originating in the first instance from practical life, positivism will return thither with increased force, now that its long period of scientific preparation is accomplished, and that it has occupied the field of moral truth, which henceforth will be its principal domain. Its principle of sympathy, so far from relaxing our efforts, will stimulate all our faculties to universal activity by urging them onwards towards perfection of every kind. Scientific study of the natural order is inculcated solely with the view of directing all the forces of man and of society to its improvement by artificial effort. Hitherto this aim has hardly been recognized, even with regard to the material world, and but a very small proportion of our energies has been spent upon it. Yet the aim is high, provided always that the view taken of human progress extend beyond its lower and more material stages. Our theoretical powers once concentrated on the moral problems which form their principal field, our practical energies will not fail to take the same direction, devoting themselves to that portion of the natural order which is most imperfect, and at the time most modifiable. With these larger and more systematic views of human life, its best efforts will be given to the improvement of the mind, and still more to the improvement of the character and to the increase of affection and courage. Public and private life are now brought into close relation by the identity of their principal aim, which, being kept constantly in sight, ennobles every action in both. Practical questions must ever continue to preponderate, as before, over questions of theory. But this condition, so far from being adverse to speculative power, concentrates it upon the most difficult of all problems, the discovery of moral and social laws, our knowledge of which will never be fully adequate to our practical requirements. Mental and practical activity of this kind can never result in hardness of feeling. On the contrary, it impresses us more strongly with the conviction that sympathy is not merely our highest happiness, but the most effectual of all our means of improvement. And that without it, all other means can be of little avail. Thus it is that in the positive system, the heart, the intellect, and the character mutually strengthen and develop one another. Because each is systematically directed to the mode of action for which it is by nature adapted. Public and private life are brought into a far more harmonious relation than in any former time, because the purpose to which both are consecrated is identical. The difference being merely in the range of their activities. The aim in both is to secure, to the utmost possible extent, the victory of social feeling over self-love. And to this aim all our powers, whether of affection, thought, or action, are in both unceasingly directed. This, then, is the shape in which the great human problem comes definitely before us. Its solution demands all the appliances of social art. The primary principle on which the solution rests is the separation of the two elementary powers of society. The moral power of counsel, and the political powers of command. The necessary preponderance of the latter, which rests upon material force, corresponds to the fact that in our imperfect nature, where the coarser wants are the most pressing and the most continuously felt, the selfish instincts are naturally stronger than the unselfish. In the absence of all compulsory authority, our action even as individuals would be feeble and purposeless, and social life still more certainly would lose its character and its energy. Moral force, therefore, by which is meant the force of conviction and persuasion, is to be regarded simply as a modifying influence, not as a means of authoritative direction. Moral force originates in feeling and in reason. It represents the social side of our nature, and to this its direct influence is limited. Indeed, by the very fact that it is the expression of our highest attributes, it is precluded from that practical ascendancy which is possessed by faculties of a lower but more energetic kind. Inferior to material force and power, though superior to it in dignity, it contrasts and opposes its own classification of men according to the standard of moral and intellectual worth, to the classification by wealth and worldly position which actually prevails. True, the higher standard will never be adopted practically, but the effort to uphold it will react beneficially on the natural order of society. It will inspire those larger views, and reanimate that sense of duty, which are so apt to become obliterated in the ordinary current of life. The means of effecting this important result, the need of which is so generally felt, will not be wanting. When the moderating power enters upon its characteristic function of preparing us for practical life by a rational system of education, throughout which, even in its intellectual department, moral considerations will predominate. This power will therefore concentrate itself upon theoretical and moral questions. And it can only maintain its position as the recognized organ of social sympathy, by invariable abstinence from political action. It will be its first duty to contend against the ambitious instincts of its own members. True, such instincts, in spite of the impurity of their source, may be of use in those natures who are really destined for the indispensable business of government. But for a spiritual power formal renunciation of wealth and rank is at the very root of its influence. It is the first of the conditions which justify it in resisting the encroachments to which political power is always tempted. Hence the classes to whose natural sympathies it looks for support are those who, like itself, are excluded from political administration. Women, from their strongly sympathetic nature, are the original source of all moral influence. And they are peculiarly qualified by the passive character of their life to assist the action of the spiritual power in the family. In its essential function of education, their cooperation is of the highest importance. The education of young children is entrusted to their sole charge. And the education of more advanced years simply consists in giving a more systematic shape to what the mother has already inculcated in childhood. As a wife, too, woman assumes still more distinctly the spiritual function of counsel. She softens by persuasion where the philosopher can only influence by conviction. In social meetings, again, the only mode of public life in which women can participate, they assist the spiritual power in the formation of public opinion, of which it is the systematic organ. By applying the principles which it inculcates to the case of particular actions or persons. In all these matters their influence will be far more effectual, when men have done their duty to women by setting them free from the necessity of gaining their own livelihood. And when women on their side have renounced both power and wealth, as we see, so often exemplified among the working classes. The affinity of the people with the philosophic power is less direct and less pure, but it will prove a vigorous ally in meeting the obstacles which the temporal power will inevitably oppose. The working classes, having but little spare time and small individual influence, cannot, except on rare occasions, participate in the practical administration of government. Since all efficient government involves concentration of power. Moral force, on the contrary, created as it is by free convergence of opinion, admits of, and indeed requires, the widest ramification. Working men, owing to their freedom from practical responsibilities and their unconcern for personal aggrandizement, are better disposed than their employers to broad views and to generous sympathies, and will therefore naturally associate themselves with the spiritual power. It is they who will furnish the basis of a true public opinion, so soon as they are enabled by positive education, which is specially framed with a view to their case, to give greater definiteness to their aspirations. Their wants and their sympathies will alike induce them to support the philosophic priesthood as the systematic guardian of their interests against the governing classes. In return for such protection they will bring the whole weight of their influence to assist the priesthood in its great social mission, the subordination of politics to morals. In those exceptional cases where it becomes necessary for the moderating power to assume political functions, the popular element will of itself suffice for the emergency, thus exempting the philosophic element from participating in an anomaly from which its character could hardly fail to suffer. As would be the case also in a still higher degree with the feminine character. The direct influence of reason over our imperfect nature is so feeble that the new priesthood could not of itself ensure such respect for its theories as would bring them to any practical result. But the sympathies of women and of the people operating as they will in every town and in every family, will be sufficient to ensure its efficacy in organizing that legitimate degree of moral pressure which the poor may bring to bear upon the rich. Moreover, we may look, as one of the results of our common system of education, for additional aid in the ranks of the governing classes themselves. For some of their noblest members will volunteer their assistance to the spiritual power, forming, so to speak, a new order of chivalry. And yet, with all this, comprehensive as our organization of moral force may be, so great is the innate strength of the selfish instincts, that our success in solving the great human problem will always fall short of what we might legitimately desire. To this conclusion we must come, in whatever way we regard the destiny of man. But it should only encourage us to combine our efforts still more strongly in order to ameliorate the order of nature in its most important, that is, in its moral aspects. These being at once the most modifiable and the most imperfect. The highest progress of man and of society consists in gradual increase of our mastery over all our defects, especially the defects of our moral nature. Among the nations of antiquity the progress in this direction was but small, all that they could do was to prepare the way for it by certain necessary phases of intellectual and social development. The whole tendency of Greek and Roman society was such as made it impossible to form a distinct conception of the great problem of our moral nature. In fact, morals were with them invariably subordinate to politics. Nevertheless, it is moral progress which alone can satisfy our nature. And in the Middle Ages it was recognized as the highest aim of human effort, notwithstanding that its intellectual and social conditions were as yet very imperfectly realized. The creeds of the Middle Ages were too unreal and imperfect, the character of society was too military and aristocratic, to allow morals and politics to assume permanently their right relation. The attempt was made, however. And, inadequate as it was enough to allow the people of the West to appreciate the fundamental principle involved in it. A principle destined to survive the opinions and the habits of life from which it arose. Its full weight could never be felt until the positive spirit had extended beyond the elementary subjects to which it had been so long subjected, to the sphere of social truth. And had thus reached the position at which a complete synthesis became possible. Equally essential was it that in those countries which had been incorporated into the Western Empire, and had passed from it into Catholic feudalism, war should be definitely superseded by industrial activity. In the long period of transition which has elapsed since the Middle Ages, both these conditions have been fulfilled, while at the same time the old system has been gradually decomposed. Finally, the great crisis of the Revolution has stimulated all advanced minds to reconsider, with better intellectual and social principles, the same problem that Christianity and chivalry had attempted. The radical solution of it was then begun, and it is now completed, and enunciated in a systematic form by positivism. All essential phases in the evolution of society answer to corresponding phases in the growth of the individual, whether it has proceeded spontaneously or under systematic guidance. Supposing always that his development be complete. But it is not enough to prove the close connection which exists between all modes and degrees of human regeneration. We have yet to find a central point round which all will naturally meet. In this point consists the unity of positivism as a system of life. Unless it can be thus condensed, round one single principle, it will never wholly supersede the synthesis of theology. Notwithstanding its superiority in the reality and stability of its component parts, and in their homogeneity and coherence as a whole. There should be a central point in the system towards which feeling, reason, and activity alike converge. The proof that positivism possesses such a central point will remove the last obstacles to its complete acceptance, as the guide of private or of public life. Such a center we find in the great conception of humanity, towards which every aspect of positivism naturally converges. By it the conception of God will be entirely superseded, and a synthesis be formed, more complete and permanent than that provisionally established by the old religions. Through it the new doctrine becomes at once accessible to men's hearts in its full extent and application. From their heart it will penetrate their minds, and thus the immediate necessity of beginning with a long and difficult course of study is avoided. Though this must of course be always indispensable to its systematic teachers. This central point of positivism is even more moral than intellectual in character. It represents the principle of love upon which the whole system rests. It is the peculiar characteristic of the great being who is here set forth, to be compounded of separable elements. Its existence depends therefore entirely upon mutual love knitting together its various parts. The calculations of self-interest can never be substituted as a combining influence for the sympathetic instincts. Yet the belief in humanity, while stimulating sympathy, at the same time enlarges the scope and vigor of the intellect. For it requires high powers of generalization to conceive clearly of this vast organism, as the result of spontaneous cooperation, abstraction made of all partial antagonisms. Reason, then, has its part in this central dogma as well as love. It enlarges and completes our conception of the Supreme Being, by revealing to us the external and internal conditions of its existence. Lastly, our active powers are stimulated by it no less than our feelings and our reason. For since humanity is so far more complex than any other organism, it will react more strongly and more continuously on its environment, submitting to its influence and so modifying it. Hence results progress, which is simply the development of order, under the influence of love. Thus, in the conception of humanity, the three essential aspects of positivism, its subjective principle, its objective dogma, and its practical object, are united. Towards humanity, who is for us the only true great being, we, the conscious elements of whom she is composed, shall henceforth direct every aspect of our life, individual or collective. Our thoughts will be devoted to the knowledge of humanity, our affections to her love, our actions to her service. Positivists then may, more truly than theological believers of whatever creed, regard life as a continuous and earnest act of worship. Worship which will elevate and purify our feelings, enlarge and enlighten our thoughts, ennoble and invigorate our actions. It supplies a direct solution, so far as a solution is possible, of the great problem of the Middle Ages, the subordination of politics to morals. For this follows at once from the consecration now given to the principle that social sympathy should preponderate over self-love. Thus positivism becomes, in the true sense of the word, a religion. The only religion which is real and complete, destined therefore to replace all imperfect and provisional systems resting on the primitive basis of theology. For even the synthesis established by the old theocracies of Egypt and India was insufficient, because, being based on purely subjective principles, it could never embrace practical life, which must always be subordinated to the objective realities of the external world. Theocracy was thus limited at the outset to the sphere of thought and of feeling. And part even of this field was soon lost when art became emancipated from theocratical control, showing a spontaneous tendency to its natural vocation of idealizing real life. Of science and of morality the priests were still left sole arbiters. But here, too, their influence materially diminished so soon as the discovery of the simpler abstract truths of positive science gave birth to Greek philosophy. Philosophy, though as yet necessarily restricted to the metaphysical stage, yet already stood forward as the rival of the sacerdotal system. Its attempts to construct were in themselves fruitless. But they overthrew polytheism, and ultimately transformed it into monotheism. In this the last phase of theology, the intellectual authority of the priests was undermined no less deeply than the principle of their doctrine. They lost their hold upon science, as long ago they had lost their hold upon art. All that remained to them was the moral guidance of society. And even this was soon compromised by the progress of free thought, progress really due to the positive spirit, although its systematic exponents still belonged to the metaphysical school. When science had expanded sufficiently to exist apart from philosophy, it showed a rapid tendency towards a synthesis of its own, alike incompatible with metaphysics and with theology. It was late in appearing, because it required a long series of preliminary efforts, but as it approached completion, it gradually brought the positive spirit to bear upon the organization of practical life, from which that spirit had originally emanated. But thoroughly to effect this result was impossible until the science of sociology had been formed, and this was done by my discovery of the law of historical development. Henceforth all true men of science will rise to the higher dignity of philosophers, and by so doing will necessarily assume something of the sacerdotal character. Because the final result to which their researches tend is the subordination of every subject of thought to the moral principle. A result which leads us at once to the acceptance of a complete and homogeneous synthesis. Thus the philosophers of the future become priests of humanity, and their moral and intellectual influence will be far wider and more deeply rooted than that of any former priesthood. The primary condition of their spiritual authority is exclusion from political power, as a guarantee that theory and practice shall be systematically kept apart. A system in which the organs of counsel and those of command are never identical cannot possibly degenerate into any of the evils of theocracy. By entirely renouncing wealth and worldly position, and that not as individuals merely, but as a body, the priests of humanity will occupy a position of unparalleled dignity. For with their moral influence they will combine what since the downfall of the old theocracies has always been separated from it, the influence of superiority in art and science. Reason, imagination, and feeling will be brought into unison, and so united will react strongly on the imperious conditions of practical life, bringing it into closer accordance with the laws of universal morality, from which it is so prone to deviate. And the influence of this new modifying power will be the greater that the synthesis on which it rests will have preceded and prepared the way for the social system of the future. Whereas theology could not arrive at its central principle, until the time of its decline was approaching. All functions, then, that cooperate in the elevation of man will be regenerated by the positive priesthood. Science, poetry, morality, will be devoted to the study, the praise, and the love of humanity, in order that under their combined influence, our political action may be more unremittingly given to her service. With such a mission, science acquires a position of unparalleled importance, as the sole means through which we come to know the nature and conditions of this great being, the worship of whom should be the distinctive feature of our whole life. For this all-important knowledge, the study of sociology would seem to suffice, but sociology itself depends upon preliminary study, first of the outer world, in which the actions of humanity take place, and secondly, of man, the individual agent. The object of positivist worship is not like that of theological believers an absolute, isolated, incomprehensible being, whose existence admits of no demonstration or comparison with anything real. The evidence of the being here set forward is spontaneous, and is shrouded in no mystery. Before we can praise, love, and serve humanity as we ought, we must know something of the laws which govern her existence, an existence more complicated than any other of which we are cognizant. And by virtue of this complexity, humanity possesses the attributes of vitality in a higher degree than any other organization. That is to say, there is at once more intimate harmony of the component elements, and more complete subordination to the external world. Immense as is the magnitude of this organism measured both in time and space, yet each of its parts carefully examined will show the general consensus of the whole. At the same time it is more dependent than any other upon the conditions of the outer world, in other words, upon the sum of the laws that regulate inferior phenomena. Like other vital organisms, it submits to mathematical, astronomical, physical, chemical, and biological conditions. And, in addition to these, is subject to special laws of sociology with which lower organisms are not concerned. But as a further result of its higher complexity it reacts upon the world more powerfully, and is indeed in a true sense its chief. Scientifically defined, then, it is truly the supreme being, the being who manifests to the fullest extent all the highest attributes of life. But there is yet another feature peculiar to humanity, and one of primary importance. That feature is, that the elements of which she is composed must always have an independent existence. In other organisms the parts have no existence when severed from the whole, but this, the greatest of all organisms, is made up of lives which can really be separated. There is, as we have seen, harmony of parts as well as independence, but the last of these conditions is as indispensable as the first. Humanity would cease to be superior to other beings were it possible for her elements to become inseparable. The two conditions are equally necessary, but the difficulty of reconciling them is so great as to account at once for the slowness with which this highest of all organisms has been developed. It must not, however, be supposed that the new supreme being is, like the old, merely a subjective result of our powers of abstraction. Its existence is revealed to us, on the contrary, by close investigation of objective fact. Man indeed, as an individual, cannot properly be said to exist, except in the exaggerated abstractions of modern metaphysicians. Existence in the true sense can only be predicated of humanity. Although the complexity of her nature prevented men from forming a systematic conception of it, until the necessary stages of scientific initiation had been passed. Bearing this conclusion in mind, we shall be able now to distinguish in humanity two distinct orders of functions, those by which she acts upon the world, and those which bind together her component parts. Humanity cannot herself act otherwise than by her separable members, but the efficiency of these members depends upon their working in cooperation, whether instinctively or with design. We find, then, external functions relating principally to the material existence of this organism, and internal functions by which its movable elements are combined. This distinction is but an application of the great theory, due to Bichat's genius, of the distinction between the life of nutrition and the life of relation which we find in the individual organism. Philosophically, it is the source from which we derive the great social principle of separation of spiritual from temporal power. The temporal power governs, it originates in the personal instincts, and it stimulates activity. On it depends social order. The spiritual power can only moderate, it is the exponent of our social instincts, and it promotes cooperation, which is the guarantee of progress. Of these functions of humanity, the first corresponds to the function of nutrition, the second to that of innervation in the individual organism. Having now viewed our subject statically, we may come to its dynamical aspect. Reserving more detailed discussion for the third volume of this treatise, which deals with my fundamental theory of human development. The great being whom we worship is not immutable any more than it is absolute. Its nature is relative, and, as such, is eminently capable of growth. In a word, it is the most vital of all living beings known to us. It extends and becomes more complex by the continuous successions of generations. But in its progressive changes as well as in its permanent functions, it is subject to invariable laws. And these laws considered, as we may now consider them, as a whole, form a more sublime object of contemplation than the solemn inaction of the old Supreme Being, whose existence was passive except when interrupted by acts of arbitrary and unintelligible volition. Thus it is only by positive science that we can appreciate this highest of all destinies to which all the fatalities of individual life are subordinate. It is with this as with subjects of minor importance, systematic study of the past is necessary in order to determine the future, and so explain the tendencies of the present. Let us then pass from the conception of humanity as fully developed, to the history of its rise and progress, a history in which all other modes of progress are included. In ancient times the conception was incompatible with the theological spirit and also with the military character of society, which involved the slavery of the productive classes. The feeling of patriotism, restricted as it was at first, was the only prelude then possible to the recognition of humanity. From this narrow nationality there arose in the Middle Ages the feeling of universal brotherhood, as soon as military life had entered on its defensive phase. And all supernatural creeds had spontaneously merged into a monotheistic form common to the whole West. The growth of chivalry, and the attempt made to effect a permanent separation of the two social powers, announced already the subordination of politics to morals, and thus showed that the conception of humanity was in direct course of preparation. But the unreal and antisocial nature of the medieval creed, and the military and aristocratic character of feudal society, made it impossible to go very far in this direction. The abolition of personal slavery was the most essential result of this important period. Society could now assume its industrial character, and feelings of fraternity were encouraged by modes of life in which all classes alike participated. Meanwhile, the growth of the positive spirit was proceeding, and preparing the way for the establishment of social science, by which alone all other positive studies should be systematized. This being done, the conception of the great being became possible. It was with reference to subjects of a speculative and scientific nature that the conception first arose in a distinct shape. As early as 2 centuries ago, Pascal spoke of the human race as one man. 12 Amidst the inevitable decline of the theological and military system, men became conscious of the movement of society, which had now advanced through so many phases. And the notion of progress as a distinctive feature of humanity became admitted. Still, the conception of humanity as the basis for a new synthesis was impossible until the crisis of the French Revolution. That crisis on the one hand proved the urgent necessity for social regeneration, and on the other gave birth to the only philosophy capable of effecting it. Thus our consciousness of the new great being has advanced coextensively with its growth. Our present conception of it is as much the measure of our social progress as it is the summary of positive knowledge. In speaking of the dignity of science when regenerated by this lofty application of it, I do not refer solely to the special science of social phenomena, but also to the preliminary studies of life and of the inorganic world, both of which form an essential portion of positive doctrine. A social mission of high importance will be recognized in the most elementary sciences, whether it be for the sake of their method or for the value of their scientific results. True, the religion of humanity will lead to the entire abolition of scientific academies, because their tendency, especially in France, is equally hurtful to science and morality. They encourage mathematicians to confine their attention exclusively to the first step in the scientific scale, and biologists to pursue their studies without any solid basis or definite purpose. Special studies carried on without regard for the encyclopedic principles which determine the relative value of knowledge, and its bearing on human life, will be condemned by all men of right feeling and good sense. Such men will feel the necessity of resisting the morbid narrowness of mind and heart to which the anarchy of our times inevitably leads. But the abolition of the academic system will only ensure a larger measure of respect for all scientific researches of real value, on whatever subject. The study of mathematics, the value of which is at present negatived by its hardening tendency, will now manifest its latent moral efficacy, as the only sure basis for firm conviction. A state of mind that can never be perfectly attained in more complex subjects of thought, except by those who have experienced it in the simpler subjects. When the close connection of all scientific knowledge becomes more generally admitted, humanity will reject political teachers who are ignorant of geometry, as well as geometricians who neglect sociology. Biology meanwhile will lose its dangerous materialism, and will receive all the respect due to its close connection with social science and its important bearing on the essential doctrines of positivism. To attempt to explain the life of humanity without first examining the lower forms of life would be as serious an error as to study biology without regard to the social purpose which biology is intended to serve. Science has now become indispensable to the establishment of moral truth, and at the same time its subordination to the inspirations of the heart is fully recognized. Thus it takes its place henceforward among the most essential functions of the priesthood of humanity. The supremacy of true feeling will strengthen reason, and will receive in turn from reason a systematic sanction. Natural philosophy, besides its evident value in regulating the spontaneous action of humanity, has a direct tendency to elevate human nature. It draws from the outer world that basis of fixed truth which is so necessary to control our various desires. The study of humanity therefore, directly or indirectly, is for the future the permanent aim of science. And science is now in a true sense consecrated, as the source from which the universal religion receives its principles. It reveals to us not merely the nature and conditions of the great being, but also its destiny and the successive phases of its growth. The aim is high and arduous. It requires continuous and combined exertion of all our faculties. But it ennobles the simplest processes of scientific investigation by connecting them permanently with subjects of the deepest interest. The scrupulous exactness and rigorous caution of the positive method, which when applied to unimportant subjects seem almost puerile, will be valued and insisted on when seen to be necessary for the efficacy of efforts relating to our most essential wants. Rationalism, in the true sense of the word, so far from being incompatible with right feeling, strengthens and develops it, by placing all the facts of the case, in social questions especially, in their true light. But, however honorable the rank which science when regenerated will hold in the new religion, the sanction given to poetry will be even more direct and unqualified. Because the function assigned to it is one which is more practical and which touches us more nearly. Its function will be the praise of humanity. All previous efforts of art have been but the prelude to this, its natural mission. A prelude often impatiently performed since art threw off the yoke of theocracy at an earlier period than science. Polytheism was the only religion under which it had free scope, there it could idealize all the passions of our nature, no attempt being made to conceal the similarity of the gods to the human type. The change from polytheism to monotheism was unacceptable to art, because it narrowed its field. But towards the close of the Middle Ages it began to shake off the influence of obscure and chimerical beliefs, and take possession of its proper sphere. The field that now lies before it in the religion of humanity is inexhaustible. It is called upon to idealize the social life of man, which, in the time of the nations of antiquity, had not been sufficiently developed to inspire the highest order of poetry. In the first place, it will be of the greatest service in enabling men to realize the conception of humanity, subject only to the condition of not overstepping the fundamental truths of science. Science unassisted cannot define the nature and destinies of this great being with sufficient clearness. In our religion, the object of worship must be conceived distinctly, in order to be ardently loved and zealously served. Science, especially in subjects of this nature, is confined within narrow limits. It leaves inevitable deficiencies which aesthetic genius must supply. And there are certain qualities in art as opposed to science, which specially qualify it for the representation of humanity. For humanity is distinguished from other forms of life by the combination of independence with cooperation, attributes which also are natural to poetry. For while poetry is more sympathetic than science, its productions have far more individuality. The genius of their author is more strongly marked in them, and the debt to his predecessors and contemporaries is less apparent. Thus the synthesis on which the inauguration of the final religion depends, is one in which art will participate more than science, science furnishing merely the necessary basis. Its influence will be even greater than in the times of polytheism. For powerful as art appeared to be in those times, it could in reality do nothing but embellish the fables to which the confused ideas of theocracy had given rise. By its aid we shall for the first time rise at last to a really human point of view, and be enabled distinctly to understand the essential attributes of the great being of whom we are members. The material power of humanity and the successive phases of her physical, her intellectual, and, above all, her moral progress, will each in turn be depicted. Without the difficulties of analytical study, we shall gain a clear knowledge of her nature and her conditions, by the poet's description of her future destiny. Of her constant struggle against painful fatalities, which have at last become a source of happiness and greatness, of the slow growth of her infancy, of her lofty hopes now so near fulfillment. The history of universal love, the soul by which this great being is animated. The history, that is, of the marvelous advance of man, individually or socially, from brutish appetite to pure unselfish sympathy, is of itself an endless theme for the poetry of the future. Comparisons, too, may be instituted, in which the poet, without specially attacking the old religion, will indicate the superiority of the new. The attributes of the new great being may be forcibly illustrated, especially during the time of transition, by contrast with the inferiority of her various predecessors. All theological types are absolute, indefinite, and immutable, consequently in none of them has it been possible to combine to a satisfactory extent the attributes of goodness, wisdom, and power. Nor can we conceive of their combination, except in a being whose existence is a matter of certainty, and who is subject to invariable laws. The gods of polytheism were endowed with energy and sympathy, but possessed neither dignity nor morality. They were superseded by the sublime deity of monotheism, who was sometimes represented as inert and passionless, sometimes as impenetrable and inflexible. But the new supreme being, having a real existence, an existence relative and modifiable, admits of being more distinctly conceived than the old. And the influence of the conception will be equally strong and far more elevating. Each one of us will recognize in it a power superior to his own, a power on which the whole destiny of his life depends. Since the life of the individual is in every respect subordinate to the evolution of the race. But the knowledge of this power has not the crushing effect of the old conception of omnipotence. For every great or good man will feel that his own life is an indispensable element in the great organism. The supremacy of humanity is but the result of individual cooperation. Her power is not supreme, it is only superior to that of all beings whom we know. Our love for her is tainted by no degrading fears, yet it is always coupled with the most sincere reverence. Perfection is in no wise claimed for her. We study her natural defects with care in order to remedy them as far as possible. The love we bear to her is a feeling as noble as it is strong. It calls for no degrading expressions of adulation, but it inspires us with unremitting zeal for moral improvement. But these and other advantages of the new religion, though they can be indicated by the philosopher, need the poet to display them in their full light. The moral grandeur of man when freed from the chimeras that oppress him, was foreseen by Goethe, and still more clearly by Byron. But the work of these men was one of destruction. And their types could only embody the spirit of revolt. Poetry must rise above the negative stage in which, owing to the circumstances of the time, their genius was arrested. And must embrace in the positive spirit the system of sociological and other laws to which human development is subject, before it can adequately portray the new man in his relation to the new God. There is yet another way in which art may serve the cause of religion. That is, in organizing the festivals, whether private or public, of which, to a great extent, the worship of humanity will consist. For this purpose aesthetic talent is far more required than scientific, the object in view being to reveal the nature of the great organism more clearly, by presenting all aspects of its existence, static or dynamic, in idealized forms. These festivals, then, should be of two kinds, corresponding to the two essential aspects of humanity, the first illustrating her existence, the second her action. Thus we shall stimulate both the elements of true social feeling, the love of order, namely, and the love of progress. In our static festivals social order and the feeling of solidarity will be illustrated, the dynamic festivals will explain social progress, and inspire the sense of historical continuity. Taken together, their periodic recurrence will form a continuation of positive education. They will develop and confirm the principles instilled in youth. But there will be nothing didactic in their form, since it is of the essence of art not to instruct otherwise than by giving pleasure. Of course, the regular recurrence of these festivals will not prevent any modifications which may be judged necessary to adapt them to special incidents that may from time to time arise. The festivals representing order will necessarily take more abstract and austere forms than those of progress. It will be their object to represent the statical relations by which the great organism preserves its unity, and the various aspects of its animating principle, love. The most universal and the most solemn of these festivals will be the Feast of Humanity, which will be held throughout the West at the beginning of the new year, thus consecrating the only custom which still remains in general use to relieve the prosaic dullness of modern life. In this feast, which celebrates the most comprehensiveness of all unions, every branch of the human race will at some future time participate. In the same month there might be 3 festivals of a secondary order, representing the minor degrees of association, the nation, the province, and the town. Giving this first month to the direct celebration of the social tie, we might devote the first days of the 4 succeeding months to the 4 principal domestic relations, connubial, parental, filial, and fraternal. In the 6th month, the honorable position of domestic service would receive its due measure of respect. These would be the static festivals. Taken together they would form a representation of the true theory of our individual and social nature, together with the principles of moral duty to which that theory gives rise. No direct mention is made of the personal instincts, notwithstanding their preponderance, because it is the main object of positive worship to bring them under the control of the social instincts. Personal virtues are by no means neglected in positive education, but to make them the objects of any special celebration, would only stimulate egotistic feeling. Indirectly their value is recognized in every part of our religious system, in the reaction which they exercise upon our generous sympathies. Their omission, therefore, implies no real deficiency in this ideal portraiture of human faculties and duties. Again, no special announcement of the subordination of humanity to the laws of the external world is needed. The consciousness of this external power pervades every part of the positive system. It controls our desires, directs our speculations, stimulates our actions. The simple fact of the recurrence of our ceremonies at fixed periods, determined by the earth's motion, is enough to remind us of our inevitable subjection to the fatalities of the external world. As the static festivals represent morality, so the dynamic festivals, those of progress, will represent history. In these the worship of humanity assumes a more concrete and animated form. as it will consist principally in rendering honor to the noblest types of each phase of human development. It is desirable, however, that each of the more important phases should be represented in itself, independently of the greatness of any individual belonging to it. Of the months unoccupied by static festivals, 3 might be given to the principal phases of the past: fetishism, polytheism, and monotheism. And a 4th to the celebration of the future, the normal state to which all these phases have been tending. Forming thus the chain of historical succession, we may consecrate each month to some one of the types who best represent the various stages. I omit, however, some explanations of detail given in the first edition of this General View, written at the time when I had not made the distinction between the abstract and concrete worship sufficiently clear. A few months after its publication, in 1848, the circumstances of the time induced me to frame a complete system of commemoration applicable to Western Europe, under the title of Positivist Calendar. 13 of this I shall speak more at length in the 4th volume of the present treatise. Its success has fully justified me in anticipating this part of my subject. To it I now refer the reader, recommending him to familiarize himself with the provisional arrangement of the new Western year then put forward and already adopted by most positivists. But the practice need not be restricted to names of European importance. It is applicable in its degree to each separate province, and even to private life. Catholicism offers 2 institutions in which the religion of the family connects itself with public worship in its most comprehensive sense. There is a day appointed in Catholic countries in which all are in the habit of visiting the tombs of those dear to them, finding consolation for their grief by sharing it with others. To this custom positivists devote the last day of the year. The working classes of Paris give every year a noble proof that complete freedom of thought is in no respect compatible with worship of the dead, which in their case is unconnected with any system. Again, there is the institution of baptismal names, which though little thought of at present, will be maintained and improved by positivism. It is an admirable mode of impressing on men the connection of private with public life, by furnishing everyone with a type for his own personal imitation. Here the superiority of the new religion is very apparent, since the choice of a name will not be limited to any time or country. In this, as in other cases, the absolute spirit of Catholicism proved fatal to its prospects of becoming universal. These brief remarks will be enough to illustrate the 2 classes of festivals instituted by positivism. In every week of the year some new aspect of order or of progress will be held up to public veneration. And in each the link connecting public and private worship will be found in the adoration of woman. In this aesthetic side of positive religion everything tends to strengthen its fundamental principle of love. All the resources of poetry, and of the other arts of sound and form, will be invoked to give full and regular expression to it. The dominant feeling is always that of deep reverence proceeding from sincere acknowledgement of benefits received. Our worship will be alike free from mysticism and from affectation. While striving to surpass our ancestors, we shall yet render due honor to all their services, and look with respect upon their systems of life. Influenced no longer by chimeras which though comforting to former times are now degrading, we have now no obstacle to becoming as far as possible incorporate with the great being whom we worship. By commemoration of past services we strengthen the desire inherent in all of us to prolong our existence in the only way which is really in our power. The fact that all human affairs are subject to one fundamental law, as soon as it becomes familiarly known, enables and encourages each one of us to live in a true sense in the past and even in the future. As those cannot do who attribute the events of life to the agency of an arbitrary and impenetrable will. The praise given to our predecessors will stimulate a noble rivalry, inspiring all with the desire to become themselves incorporate into this mighty being whose life endures through all time, and who is formed of the dead far more than the living. When the system of commemoration is fully developed, no worthy cooperator will be excluded, however humble his sphere. Whether limited to his family or town, or extending to his country or to the whole West. The education of positivists will soon convince them that such recompense for honorable conduct is ample compensation for the imaginary hopes which inspired their predecessors. To live in others is, in the truest sense of the word, life. Indeed, the best part of our own life is passed thus. As yet this truth has not been grasped firmly, because the social point of view has never yet been brought systematically before us. But the religion of humanity, by giving an aesthetic form to the positivist synthesis, will make it intelligible to minds of every class, and will enable us to enjoy the untold charm springing from the sympathies of union and of continuity when allowed free play. To prolong our life indefinitely in the past and future, so as to make it more perfect in the present, is abundant compensation for the illusions of our youth which have now passed away forever. Science, which deprived us of these imaginary comforts, itself in its maturity supplies the solid basis for consolation of a kind unknown before. The hope of becoming incorporate into the great being whose static and dynamic laws it has revealed. On this firm foundation poetry raises the structure of public and private worship. And thus all are made active partakers of this universal life, which minds still fettered by theology cannot understand. Thus imagination, while accepting the guidance of reason, will exercise a far more efficient and extensive influence than in the days of polytheism. For the priests of humanity, the sole purpose of science is to prepare the field for art, whether aesthetic or industrial. This object once attained, poetic study or composition will form the chief occupation of our speculative faculties. The poet is now called to his true mission, which is to give beauty and grandeur to human life, by inspiring a deeper sense of our relation to humanity. Poetry will form the basis of the ceremonies in which the new priesthood will solemnize more efficiently than the old, the most important events of private life, especially birth, marriage, and death, so as to impress the family as well as the state with the sense of this relation. Forced as we are henceforth to concentrate all our hopes and efforts upon the real life around us, we shall feel more strongly than ever that all the powers of imagination as well as those of reason, feeling, and activity, are required in its service. Poetry once raised to its proper place, the arts of sound and form, which render in a more vivid way the subjects which poetry has suggested, will soon follow. Their sphere, like that of poetry, will be the celebration of humanity. An exhaustless field, leaving no cause to regret the chimeras which, in the present empirical condition of these arts, are still considered indispensable. Music in modern times has been limited almost entirely to the expression of individual emotions. Its full power has never been felt in public life, except in the solitary instance of the Marseillaise, in which the whole spirit of our great revolution stands recorded. But in the worship of humanity, based as it is on positive education, and animated by the spirit of poetry, music, as the most social of the special arts, will aid in the representation of the attributes and destinies of humanity, and in the glorification of great historical types. Painting and sculpture will have the same object. They will enable us to realize the conception of humanity with greater clearness and precision than would be possible for poetry, even with the aid of music. The beautiful attempts of the artists of the 16th century, men who had very little theological belief, to embody the Christian ideal of woman, may be regarded as an unconscious prelude to the representation of humanity, in the form which of all others is most suitable. Under the impulse of these feelings, the sculptor will overcome the technical difficulties of representing figures in groups, and will adopt such subjects by preference. Hitherto this has only been effected in bas-reliefs, works which stand midway between painting and sculpture. There are, however, some splendid exceptions from which we can imagine the scope and grandeur of the latter art, when raised to its true position. Statuesque groups, whether the figures are joined or, as is preferable, separate, will enable the sculptor to undertake many great subjects from which he has been hitherto debarred. In architecture the influence of positivism will be felt less rapidly, but ultimately this art like the rest will be made available for the new religion. The buildings erected for the service of God may for a time suffice for the worship of humanity. In the same way that Christian worship was carried on at first in pagan temples as they were gradually vacated. But ultimately buildings will be required more specially adapted to a religion in which all the functions connected with education and worship are so entirely different. What these buildings will be it would be useless at present to inquire. It is less easy to foresee the positivist ideal in architecture than in any other arts. And it must remain uncertain until the new principles of education have been generally spread, and until the positivist religion, having received all the aid that poetry, music, and the arts of form can give, has become the accepted faith of Western Europe. When the more advanced nations are heartily engaged in the cause, the true temples of humanity will soon arise. By that time mental and moral regeneration will have advanced far enough to commence the reconstruction of all political institutions. Until then the new religion will avail itself of Christian churches as these gradually become vacant. Art then, as well as science, partakes in the regenerating influence which positivism derives from its synthetic principle of love. Both are called to their proper functions, the one to contemplate, the other to glorify humanity, in order that we may love and serve her more perfectly. Yet while the intellect is thus made the servant of the heart, far from being weakened by this subordinate position, it finds in it an exhaustless field, in which the value of its labors is amply recognized. Each of its faculties is called directly into play, and is supplied with its appropriate employment. Poetry institutes the forms of the worship of humanity. Science supplies the principles on which those forms are framed, by connecting them with the laws of the external world. Imagination, while ceasing to usurp the place of reason, yet enhances rather than diminishes its original influence, which the new philosophy shows to be as beneficial as it is natural. And thus human life at last attains that state of perfect harmony which has been so long sought for in vain, and which consists in the direction of all our faculties to one common purpose under the supremacy of affection. At the same time all former efforts of imagination and reason, even when they clashed with each other, are fully appreciated. Because we see that they developed our powers, that they taught us the conditions of their equilibrium, and made it manifest that nothing but that equilibrium was wanting to allow them to work together for our welfare. Above all do we recognize the immense value of the medieval attempt to form a complete synthesis, although, notwithstanding all the results of Greek and Roman civilization, the time was not yet ripe for it. To renew that attempt upon a sounder basis, and with surer prospects of success, is the object of those who found the religion of humanity. Widely different as are their circumstances and the means they employ, they desire to regard themselves as the successors of the great men who conducted the progressive movement of Catholicism. For those alone are worthy to be called successors, who continue or carry into effect the undertakings which former times have left unfinished. The title is utterly unmerited by blind followers of obsolete dogmas, which have long ceased to bear any relation to their original purpose, and which their very authors, if now living, would disavow. But while bearing in mind our debt to Catholicism, we need not omit to recognize how largely positivism gains by comparison with it. Full justice will be done to the aims of Catholicism, and to the excellence of its results. But the whole effect of positivist worship will be to make men feel clearly how far superior in every respect is the synthesis founded on the love of humanity to that founded on the love of God. Christianity satisfied no part of our nature fully, except the affections. It rejected imagination, it shrank from reason, and therefore its power was always contested, and could not last. Even in its own sphere of affection, its principles never lent themselves to that social direction which the Catholic priesthood, with such remarkable persistency, endeavored to give to them. The aim which it set before men, being unreal and personal, was ill-suited to a life of reality and of social sympathy. It is true that the universality of this supreme affection was indirectly a bond of union, but only when it was not at variance with true social feeling. And from the nature of the system, opposition between these two principles was the rule, and harmony the exception. Since the love of God, even as viewed by the best Catholic types, required in almost all cases the abandonment of every other passion. The moral value of such a synthesis consisted solely in the discipline which it established. Discipline of whatever kind being preferable to anarchy, which would have given free scope to all the lowest propensities. But notwithstanding all the tender feeling of the best mystics, the affection which to them was supreme admitted of no real reciprocity. Moreover, the stupendous nature of the rewards and penalties by which every precept in this arbitrary system was enforced, tended to weaken the character and to taint our noblest impulses. The essential merit of the system was that it was the first attempt to exercise systematic control over our moral nature. The discipline of polytheism was usually confined to actions, sometimes it extended to habits, but it never touched the affections from which both habits and actions spring. Christianity took the best means of effecting its purpose that were then available, but it was not successful, except so far as it gave indirect encouragement to our higher feelings. And so vague and absolute were its principles, that even this would have been impossible, but for the wisdom of the priesthood, who for a long time saved society from the dangers incident to so arbitrary a system. But at the close of the Middle Ages, when the priesthood became retrograde, and lost at once their morality and their freedom, the doctrine was left to its own impotence, and rapidly degenerated till it became a chronic source of degradation and of discord. But the synthesis based upon love of humanity has too deep a foundation in positive truth to be liable to similar decline. And its influence cannot but increase so long as the progress of our race endures. The great being, who is its object, tolerates the most searching inquiry, and yet does not restrict the scope of imagination. The laws which regulate her existence are now known to us. And the more deeply her nature is investigated, the stronger is our consciousness of her reality and of the greatness of her benefits. The thought of her stimulates all the powers of imagination, and thus enables us to participate in a measure in the universality of her life, throughout the whole extent of time and space of which we have any real knowledge. All our real intellectual results, whether in art or science, are alike coordinated by the religion of humanity. For it furnishes the sole bond of connection by which permanent harmony can be established between our thoughts and our feelings. It is the only system which without artifice and without arbitrary restriction, can establish the preponderance of affection over thought and action. It sets forth social feeling as the first principle of morality, without ignoring the natural superiority in strength of the personal instincts. To live for others it holds to be the highest happiness. To become incorporate with humanity, to sympathize with all her former phases, to foresee her destinies in the future, and to do what lies in us to forward them. This is what it puts before us as the constant aim of life. Self-love in the positive system is regarded as the great infirmity of our nature, an infirmity which unremitting discipline on the part of each individual and of society may materially palliate, but will never radically cure. The degree to which this mastery over our own nature is attained is the truest standard of individual or social progress, since it has the closest relation to the existence of the great being, and to the happiness of the elements that compose it. Inspired as it is by sincere gratitude, which increases the more carefully the grounds for it are examined. The worship of humanity raises prayer for the first time above the degrading influence of self-interest. We pray to the Supreme Being, but only to express our deep thankfulness for her present and past benefits, which are an earnest of still greater blessings in the future. Doubtless it is a fact of human nature, that habitual expression of such feelings reacts beneficially on our moral nature, and so far we, too, find in prayer a noble recompense. But it is one that can suggest to us no selfish thoughts, since it cannot come at all unless it comes spontaneously. Our highest happiness consists in love. And we know that more than any other feeling love may be strengthened by exercise, that alone of all feelings it admits of, and increases with, simultaneous expansion in all. Humanity will become more familiar to us than the old gods were to the polytheists, yet without the loss of dignity which, in their case, resulted from familiarity. Her nature has in it nothing arbitrary, yet she cooperates with us in the worship that we render, since in honoring her we receive back grace for grace. Homage accepted by the deity of former times laid him open to the charge of puerile vanity. But the new deity will accept praise only where it is deserved, and will derive from it equal benefit with ourselves. This perfect reciprocity of affection and of influence is peculiar to positive religion, because in it alone the object of worship is a being whose nature is relative, modifiable, and perfectible. A being of whom her own worshippers form a part, and the laws of whose existence, being more clearly known than theirs, allow her desires and her tendencies to be more distinctly foreseen. The morality of positive religion combines all the advantages of spontaneousness with those of demonstration. It is so thoroughly human in all its parts, as to preclude all the subterfuges by which repentance for transgression is so often stifled or evaded. By pointing out distinctly the way in which each individual action reacts upon society, it forces us to judge our own conduct without lowering our standard. Some might think it too gentle, and not sufficiently vigorous. Yet the love by which it is inspired is no passive feeling, but a principle which strongly stimulates our energies to the full extent compatible with the attainment of that highest good to which it is ever tending. Accepting the truths of science, it teaches that we must look to our own unremitting activity for the only providence by which the rigor of our destiny can be alleviated. We know well that the great organism, superior though it be to all beings known to us, is yet under the dominion of inscrutable laws, and is in no respect either absolutely perfect or absolutely secure from danger. Every condition of our existence, whether those of the external world or those of our own nature, might at some time be compromised. Even our moral and intellectual faculties, on which our highest interests depend, are no exception to this truth. Such contingencies are always possible, and yet they are not to prevent us from living nobly. They must not lessen our love, our thought, or our efforts for humanity. They must not overwhelm us with anxiety, nor urge us to useless complaint. But the very principles which demand this high standard of courage and resignation, are themselves well calculated to maintain it. For by making us fully conscious of the greatness of man, and by setting us free from the degrading influences of fear, they inspire us with keen interest in our efforts, inadequate though they be, against the pressure of fatalities which are not always beyond our power to modify. And thus the reaction of these fatalities upon our character is turned at last to a most beneficial use. It prevents alike overweening anxiety for our own interests and dull indifference to them. Whereas, in theological and metaphysical systems, even when inculcating self-denial, there is always a dangerous tendency to concentrate thought on personal considerations. Dignified reaction where modification of them is possible, such is the moral standard which positivism puts forward for individuals and for society. Catholicism, notwithstanding the radical defects of its doctrine, has unconsciously been influenced by the modern spirit, and at the close of the Middle Ages was tending in a direction similar to that here described, although its principles were inconsistent with any formal recognition of it. It is only in the countries that have been preserved from Protestantism that any traces are left of these faint efforts of the priesthood to rise above their own theories. The Catholic God would gradually change into a feeble and imperfect representation of humanity. Were not the clergy so degraded socially as to be unable to participate in the spontaneous feelings of the community? It is a tendency too slightly marked to lead to any important result. Yet it is a striking proof of the new direction which men's minds and hearts are unconsciously taking in countries which are often supposed to be altogether left behind in the march of modern thought. The clearest indication of it is in their acceptance of the worship of woman, which is the first step towards the worship of humanity. Since the 12th century, the influence of the Virgin, especially in Spain and Italy, has been constantly on the increase. The priesthood have often protested against it, but without effect. And sometimes they have found it necessary to sanction it, for the sake of preserving their authority. The special and privileged adoration which this beautiful creation of poetry has received, could not but produce a marked change in the spirit of Catholicism. It may serve as a connecting link between the religion of our ancestors and that of our descendants, the Virgin becoming gradually regarded as a personification of humanity. Little, however, will be done in this direction by the established priesthood, whether in Italy or Spain. We must look to the purer agency of women, who will be the means of introducing positivism among our Southern brethren. All the points, then, in which the morality of positive science excels the morality of revealed religion are summed up in the substitution of love of humanity for love of God. It is a principle as adverse to metaphysics as to theology, since it excludes all personal considerations, and places happiness, whether for the individual or for society, in constant exercise of kindly feeling. To love humanity may be truly said to constitute the whole duty of man, provided it be clearly understood what such love really implies, and what are the conditions required for maintaining it. The victory of social feeling over our innate self-love is rendered possible only by a slow and difficult training of the heart, in which the intellect must cooperate. The most important part of this training consists in the mutual love of man and woman, with all other family affections which precede and follow it. But every aspect of morality, even the personal virtues, are included in love of humanity. It furnishes the best measure of their relative importance, and the surest method for laying down incontestable rules of conduct. And thus we find the principles of systematic morality to be identical with those of spontaneous morality, a result which renders positive doctrine equally accessible to all. Science, therefore, poetry, and morality, will alike be regenerated by the new religion, and will ultimately form one harmonious whole, on which the destinies of man will henceforth rest. With women, to whom the first germs of spiritual power are due, this consecration of the rational and imaginative faculties to the source of feeling has always existed spontaneously. But to realize it in social life it must be brought forward in a systematic form as part of a general doctrine. This is what the medieval system attempted upon the basis of monotheism. A moral power arose composed of the two elements essential to such a power, the sympathetic influence of women in the family, the systematic influence of the priesthood on public life. As a preliminary attempt the Catholic system was most beneficial, but it could not last, because the synthesis on which it rested was imperfect and unstable. The Catholic doctrine and worship addressed themselves exclusively to our emotional nature, and even from the moral point of view their principles were uncertain and arbitrary. The field of intellect, whether in art or science, as well as that of practical life, would have been left almost untouched but for the personal character of the priests. But with the loss of their political independence, which had been always in danger from the military tendencies of the time, the priesthood rapidly degenerated. The system was in fact premature. And even before the industrial era of modern times had set in, the aesthetic and metaphysical growth of the times had already gone too far for its feeble power of control. And it then became as hostile to progress as it had formerly been favorable to it. Moral qualities without intellectual superiority are not enough for a true spiritual power. They will not enable it to modify to any appreciable extent the strong preponderance of material considerations. Consequently, it is the primary condition of social reorganization to put an end to the state of utter revolt which the intellect maintains against the heart. A state which has existed ever since the close of the Middle Ages and the source of which may be traced as far back as the Greek metaphysicians. Positivism has at last overcome the immense difficulties of this task. Its solution consists in the foundation of social science on the basis of the preliminary sciences, so that at last there is unity of method in our conceptions. Our active faculties have always been guided by the positive spirit, and by its extension to the sphere of feeling, a complete synthesis, alike spontaneous and systematic in its nature, is constructed. And every part of our nature is brought under the regenerating influence of the worship of humanity. Thus a new spiritual power will arise, complete and homogeneous in structure, coherent and at the same time progressive, and better calculated than Catholicism to engage the support of women, which is so necessary to its efficient action on society. Were it not for the material necessities of human life, nothing further would be required for its guidance than a spiritual power such as is here described. We should have in that case no need for any laborious exertion, and universal benevolence would be looked upon as the sovereign good, and would become the direct object of all our efforts. All that would be necessary would be to call our reasoning powers, and still more, our imagination into play, in order to keep this object constantly in view. Purely fictitious as such an hypothesis may be, it is yet an ideal limit, to which our actual life should be more and more nearly approximated. As an utopia, it is a fit subject for the poet, and in his hands it will supply the new religion with resources far superior to any that Christianity derived from vague and unreal pictures of future bliss. In it we may carry out a more perfect social classification, in which men may be ranked by moral and intellectual merit, irrespectively of wealth or position. For the only standard by which in such a state men could be tried would be their capacity to love and to please humanity. Such a standard will of course never be practically accepted, and indeed the classification in question would be impossible to effect, yet it should always be present to our minds, and should be contrasted dispassionately with the actual arrangements of social rank, with which power, even where accidentally acquired, has more to do than worth. The priests of humanity with the assistance of women will avail themselves largely of this contrast in modifying the existing order. Positivist education will fully explain its moral validity, and in our religious services appeal will frequently be made to it. Although an ideal abstraction, yet being based on reality, except so far as the necessities of daily life are concerned. It will be far more efficacious than the vague and uncertain classification founded on the theological doctrine of a future state. When society learns to admit no other providence than its own, it will go so far in adopting this ideal classification as to produce a strong effect on the classes who are the best aware of its impracticability. But those who press this contrast must be careful always to respect the natural laws which regulate the distribution of wealth and rank. They have a definite social function, and that function is not to be destroyed, but to be improved and regulated. In order, therefore, to reconcile these conditions, we must limit our ideal classification to individuals, leaving the actual subordination of office and position unaffected. Well-marked personal superiority is not very common, and society would be wasting its powers in useless and interminable controversy if it undertook to give each function to its best organ, thus dispossessing the former functionary without taking into account the conditions of practical experience. Even in the spiritual hierarchy, where it is easier to judge of merit, such a course would be utterly subversive of discipline. But there would be no political danger, and morally there would be great advantage in pointing out all remarkable cases which illustrate the difference between the order of rank and the order of merit. Respect may be shown to be noblest without compromising the authority of the strongest. Saint Bernard was esteemed more highly than any of the popes of his time. Yet he remained in the humble position of an abbot, and never failed to show the most perfect deference for the higher functionaries of the Church. A still more striking example was furnished by St. Paul in recognizing the official superiority of St. Peter, of whose moral and mental inferiority to himself he must have been well aware. All organized corporations, civil or military, can show instances on a less important scale where the abstract order of merit has been adopted consistently with the concrete order of rank. Where this is the case, the two may be contrasted without any subversive consequences. The contrast will be morally beneficial to all classes, at the same time that it proves the imperfection to which so complicated an organism as human society must be ever liable. Thus the religion of humanity creates an intellectual and moral power, which, could human life be freed from the pressure of material wants, would suffice for its guidance. Imperfect as our nature assuredly is, yet social sympathy has an intrinsic charm which would make it paramount. But for the imperious necessities by which the instincts of self-preservation are stimulated, so urgent are they, that the greater part of life is necessarily occupied with actions of a self-regarding kind, before which reason, imagination, and even feeling, have to give way. Consequently this moral power, which seems so well adapted for the direction of society, must only attempt to act as a modifying influence. Its sympathetic element, in other words, women, accept this necessity without difficulty, for true affection always takes the right course of action, as soon as it is clearly indicated. But the intellect is far more unwilling to take a subordinate position. Its rash ambition is far more unsettling to the world than the ambition of rank and wealth, against which it so often inveighs. It is the hardest of social problems to regulate the exercise of the intellectual powers, while securing them their due measure of influence. The object being that theoretical power should be able really to modify, and yet should never be permitted to govern. For the nations of antiquity this problem was insoluble. With them the intellect was always either a tyrant or a slave. The solution was attempted in the Middle Ages, but without success, owing to the military and theological character of the times. Positivism relies for solving it on the reality which is one of its principal features, and on the fact that society has now entered on its industrial phase. Based on accurate inquiry into the past and future destinies of man, its aim is so to regenerate our political action, as to transform it ultimately into a practical worship of humanity. Morality being the worship rendered by the affections, science and poetry that rendered by the intellect. Such is the principal mission of the Occidental priesthood, a mission in which women and the working classes will actively cooperate. The most important object of this regenerated polity will be the substitution of duties for rights, thus subordinating personal to social considerations. The word right should be excluded from political language, as the word cause from the language of philosophy. Both are theological and metaphysical conceptions. And the former is as immoral and subversive as the latter is unmeaning and sophistical. Both are alike incompatible with the final state. And their value during the revolutionary period of modern history has simply consisted in their solvent action upon previous systems. Rights, in the strict sense of the word, are possible only so long as power is considered as emanating from a superhuman will. Rights, under all theological systems, were divine. But in their opposition to theocracy, the metaphysicians of the last 5 centuries introduced what they called the rights of man. A conception, the value of which consisted simply in its destructive effects. Whenever it has been taken as the basis of a constructive policy, its antisocial character, and its tendency to strengthen individualism have always been apparent. In the positive state, where no supernatural claims are admissible, the idea of right will entirely disappear. Everyone has duties towards all. But rights in the ordinary sense can be claimed by none. Whatever security the individual may require is found in the general acknowledgement of reciprocal obligations. And this gives a moral equivalent for rights as hitherto claimed, without the serious political dangers which they involved. In other words, no one has in any case any right but that of doing his duty. The adoption of this principle is the one way of realizing the grand ideal of the Middle Ages, the subordination of politics to morals. In those times, however, the vast bearings of the question were but very imperfectly apprehended. Its solution is incompatible with every form of theology, and is only to be found in positivism. The solution consists in regarding our political and social action as the service of humanity. Its object should be to assist by conscious effort all functions, whether relating to order or to progress, which humanity has hitherto performed spontaneously. This is the ultimate object of positive religion. Without it all other aspects of that religion would be inadequate, and would soon cease to have any value. True affection does not stop short at desire for good, it strains every effort to attain it. The elevation of soul arising from the act of contemplating and adoring humanity is not the sole object of religious worship. Above and beyond this there is the motive of becoming better able to serve humanity, unceasing action on our part being necessary for her preservation and development. This indeed is the most distinctive feature of positive religion. The Supreme Being of former times had really little need of human services. The consequence was, that with all theological believers, and with monotheists especially, devotion always tended to degenerate into quietism. The danger could only be obviated when the priesthood had sufficient wisdom to take advantage of the vagueness of these theories, and to draw from them motives for practical exertion. Nothing could be done in this direction unless the priesthood retained their social independence. As soon as this was taken from them by the usurpation of the temporal power, the more sincere amongst Catholics lapsed into the quietistic spirit which for a long time had been kept in check. In positivism, on the contrary, the doctrine itself, irrespective of the character of its teachers, is a direct and continuous incentive to exertion of every kind. The reason for this is to be found in the relative and dependent nature of our Supreme Being, of whom her own worshippers form a part. In this, which is the essential service of humanity, and which infuses a religious spirit into every act of life, the feature most prominent is cooperation of effort. Cooperation on so vast a scale that less complicated organisms have nothing to compare with it. The consensus of the social organism extends to time as well as space. Hence the two distinct aspects of social sympathy, the feeling of solidarity, or union with the present, and of continuity, or union with the past. Careful investigation of any social phenomenon, whether relating to order or to progress, always proves convergence, direct or indirect, of all contemporaries and of all former generations, within certain geographical and chronological limits. And those limits recede as the development of humanity advances. In our thoughts and feelings such convergence is unquestionable. And it should be still more evident in our actions, the efficacy of which depends on cooperations to a still greater degree. Here we feel how false as well as immoral is the notion of right, a word which, as commonly used, implies absolute individuality. The only principle on which politics can be subordinated to morals is, that individuals should be regarded, not as so many distinct beings, but as organs of one supreme being. Indeed, in all settled states of society, the individual has always been considered as a public functionary, filling more or less efficiently a definite post, whether formally appointed to it or not. So fundamental a principle has ever been recognized instinctively up to the period of revolutionary transition, which is now at length coming to an end. A period in which the obstructive and corrupt character of organized society roused a spirit of anarchy which, though at first favorable to progress, has now become an obstacle to it. Positivism, however, will place this principle beyond reach of attack, by giving a systematic demonstration of it, based on the sum of our scientific knowledge. And this demonstration will be the intellectual basis on which the moral authority of the new priesthood will rest. What they have to do is to show the dependence of each important question, as it arises, upon social cooperation, and by this means to indicate the right path of duty. For this purpose all their scientific knowledge and aesthetic power will be needed, otherwise social feeling could never be developed sufficiently to produce any strong effect upon conduct. It would never, that is, go further than the feelings of mere solidarity with the present, which is only its incipient and rudimentary form. We see this unfortunate narrowness of view too often in the best socialists, who, leaving the present without roots in the past, would carry us headlong towards a future of which they have no definite conception. In all social phenomena, and especially in those of modern times, the participation of our predecessors is greater than that of our contemporaries. This truth is especially apparent in industrial undertakings, for which the combination of efforts required is so vast. It is our filiation with the past, even more than our connection with the present, which teaches us that the only real life is the collective life of the race. That individual life has no existence except as an abstraction. Continuity is the feature which distinguishes our race from all others. Many of the lower races are able to form a union among their living members. But it was reserved for man to conceive and realize cooperation of successive generations, the source to which the gradual growth of civilization is to be traced. Social sympathy is a barren and imperfect feeling, and indeed it is a cause of disturbance, so long as it extends no further than the present time. It is a disregard for historical continuity which induces that mistaken antipathy to all forms of inheritance which is now so common. Scientific study of history would soon convince those of our socialist writers who are sincere of their radical error in this respect. If they were more familiar with the collective inheritance of society, the value of which no one can seriously dispute, they would feel less objection to inheritance in its application to individuals or families. Practical experience, moreover, bringing them into contact with the facts of the case. Will gradually show them that without the sense of continuity with the past they cannot really understand their solidarity with the present. For, in the first place, each individual in the course of his growth passes spontaneously through phases corresponding in a great measure to those of our historical development. And therefore, without some knowledge of the history of society, he cannot understand the history of his own life. Again, each of these successive phases may be found amongst the less advanced nations who do not as yet share in the general progress of humanity. So that we cannot properly sympathize with these nations, if we ignore the successive stages of development in Western Europe. The nobler socialists and communists, those especially who belong to the working classes, will soon be alive to the error and danger of these inconsistencies, and will supply this deficiency in their education, which at present vitiates their efforts. With women, the purest and most spontaneous element of the moderating power, the priests of humanity will find it less difficult to introduce the broad principles of historical science. They are more inclined than any other class to recognize our continuity with the past, being themselves its original source. Without a scientific basis, therefore, a basis which must itself rest on the whole sum of positive speculation, it is impossible for our social sympathies to develop themselves fully, so as to extend not to the present only, but also and still more strongly to the past. And this is the first motive, a motive founded alike on moral and on intellectual considerations, for the separation of temporal from spiritual power in the final organization of society. The more vigorously we concentrate our efforts upon social progress, the more clearly shall we feel the impossibility of modifying social phenomena without knowledge of the laws that regulate them. This involves the existence of an intellectual class specially devoted to the study of social phenomena. Such a class will be invested with the consultative authority for which their knowledge qualifies them, and also with the function of teaching necessary for the diffusion of their principles. In the minor arts of life it is generally recognized that principles should be investigated and taught by thinkers who are not concerned in applying them. In the art of social life, so far more difficult and important than any other, the separation of theory from practice is of far greater moment. The wisdom of such a course is obvious, and all opposition to it will be overcome, as soon as it becomes generally recognized that social phenomena are subject to invariable laws. Laws of so complicated a character and so dependent upon other sciences as to make it doubly necessary that minds of the highest order should be specially devoted to their interpretation. But there is another aspect of the question of not less importance in sound polity. Separation of temporal from spiritual power is as necessary for free individual activity as for social cooperation. Humanity is characterized by the independence as well as by the convergence of the individuals or families of which she is composed. The latter condition, convergence, is that which secures order. But the former is no less essential to progress. Both are alike urgent, yet in ancient times they were incompatible, for the reason that spiritual and temporal power were always in the same hands. In the hands of the priests in some cases, at other times in those of the military chief. As long as the state held together, the independence of the individual was habitually sacrificed to the convergence of the body politic. This explains why the conception of progress never arose, even in the minds of the most visionary schemers. The two conditions were irreconcilable until the Middle Ages, when a remarkable attempt was made to separate the modifying power from the governing power, and so to make politics subordinate to morals. Cooperation of efforts was now placed on a different footing. It was the result of free assent rendered by the heart and understanding to a religious system which laid down general rules of conduct, in which nothing was arbitrary, and which were applied to governors as strictly as to their subjects. The consequence was that Catholicism, notwithstanding its extreme defects intellectually and socially, produced moral and political results of very great value. Chivalry arose, a type of life, in which the most vigorous independence was combined with the most intense devotion to a common cause. Every class in Western society was elevated by this union of personal dignity with universal brotherhood. So well is human nature adapted for this combination, that it arose under the first religious system of which the principles were not incompatible with it. With the necessary decay of that religion, it became seriously impaired, but yet was preserved instinctively, especially in countries untouched by Protestantism. By it the medieval system prepared the way for the conception of humanity. Since it put an end to the fatal opposition in which the two characteristic attributes of humanity, independence and cooperation, had hitherto existed. Catholicism brought unity into theological religion, and by doing so, led to its decline. But it paved the way long beforehand for the more complete and more real principle of unity on which human society will be finally organized. But meritorious and useful as this premature attempt was, it was no real solution of the problem. The spirit and temper of the period were not ripe for any definite solution. Theological belief and military life were alike inconsistent with any permanent separation of theoretical and practical powers. It was maintained only for a few centuries precariously and inadequately, by a sort of natural balance or rather oscillation between imperialism and theocracy. But the positive spirit and the industrial character of modern times tend naturally to this division of power. And when it is consciously recognized as a principle, the difficulty of reconciling cooperation with independence will exist no longer. For in the first place, the rules to which human conduct will be subjected, will rest, as in Catholic times, but to a still higher degree, upon persuasion and conviction, instead of compulsion. Again, the fact of the new faith being always susceptible of demonstration, renders the spiritual system based on it more elevating as well as more durable. The rules of Catholic morality were only saved from being arbitrary by the introduction of a supernatural will as a substitute for mere human authority. The plan had undoubtedly many advantages. But liberty in the true sense was not secured by it, since the rules remained as before without explanation. It was only their source that was changed. Still less successful was the subsequent attempt of metaphysicians to prove that submission to government was the foundation of virtue. It was only a return to the old system of arbitrary wills, stripped of the theocratic sanction to which all its claims to respect and its freedom from caprice had been due. The only way to reconcile independence with social union, and thereby to reach true liberty, lies in obedience to the objective laws of the world and of human nature. Clearing these as far as possible of all that is subjective, and thus rendering them amenable to scientific demonstration. Of such immense consequence to society will it be to extend the scientific method to the complex and important phenomena of human nature. Man will no longer be the slave of man. He yields only to external law, and to this those who demonstrate it to him are as submissive as himself. In such obedience there can be no degradation even where the laws are inflexible. But, as positivism shows us, in most cases they are modifiable, and this especially in the case of our mental and moral constitution. Consequently our obedience is here no longer passive obedience, it implies the devotion of every faculty of our nature to the improvement of a world of which we are in a true sense masters. The natural laws to which we owe submission furnish the basis for our intervention, they direct our efforts and give stability to our purpose. The more perfectly they are known, the more free will our conduct become from arbitrary command or servile obedience. True, our knowledge of these laws will very seldom attain such precision as to enable us to do altogether without compulsory authority. When the intellect is inadequate, the heart must take its place. There are certain rules of life for which it is difficult to assign the exact ground, and where affection must assist reason in supplying motives for obedience. Wholly to dispense with arbitrary authority is impossible. Nor will it degrade us to submit to it, provided that it be always regarded as secondary to the uniform supremacy of external laws. And that every step in the development of our mental and moral powers shall restrict its employment. Both conditions are evidently satisfied in the positive system of life. The tendency of modern industry and science is to make us less dependent on individual caprice, as well as more assimilable to the universal organism. Positivism therefore secures the liberty and dignity of man by its demonstration that social phenomena, like all others, are subject to natural laws, which, within certain limits, are modifiable by wise action on the part of society. Totally contrary, on the other hand, is the spirit of metaphysical schemes of polity, in which society is supposed to have no spontaneous impulses, and is handed over to the will of the legislator. In these degrading and oppressive schemes, union is purchased, as in ancient times, at the cost of independence. In these two ways, then, positive religion influences the practical life of humanity, in accordance with the natural laws that regulate her existence. First, the sense of solidarity with the present is perfected by adding to it the sense of continuity with the past. Secondly, the cooperation of her individual agents is rendered compatible with their independence. Not till this is done can politics become really subordinate to morals, and the feeling of duty be substituted for that of right. Our active powers will be modified by the combined influence of feeling and reason, as expressed in indisputable rules which it will be for the spiritual power to make known to us. Temporal government, whoever its administrators may be, will always be modified by morality. Whereas in all metaphysical systems of polity nothing is provided for but the modes of access to government and the limits of its various departments. No principles are given to direct its application or to enable us to form a right judgment of it. From this general view of the practical service of humanity, we pass now to the two leading divisions of the subject. With the view of completing our conception of the fundamental principle of positive polity, the separation of temporal from spiritual power. The action of humanity relates either to her external circumstances, or to the facts of her own nature. Each of these two great functions involves both order and progress. But the first relates more specially to the preservation of her existence, the second to her progressive development. Humanity, like every other organism, has to act unceasingly on the surrounding world in order to maintain and extend her material existence. Thus the chief object of her practical life is to satisfy the wants of our physical nature, wants which necessitate continual reproduction of materials in sufficient quantities. This production soon comes to depend more on the cooperation of successive generations than on that of contemporaries. Even in these lower but indispensable functions, we work principally for our successors, and the results that we enjoy are in great part due to those that have gone before us. Each generation produces more material wealth than is required for its own wants, and the use of the surplus is to facilitate the labor and prepare the maintenance of the generation following. The agents in this transmission of wealth naturally take the lead in the industrial movement. Since the possession of provisions and instruments of production gives an advantage which can only be lost by unusual incapacity. And this will seldom happen, because capital naturally tends to accumulate with those who make a cautious and skillful use of it. Capitalists then will be the temporal chiefs of modern society. Their office is consecrated in positive religion as that of the nutritive organs of humanity. Organs which collect and prepare the materials necessary for life, and which also distribute them, subject always to the influence of a modifying central organ. The direct and palpable importance of their functions is a stimulus to pride. And in every respect they are strongly influenced by personal instincts, which are necessary to sustain the vigor of their energies. Consequently, if left to themselves, they are apt to abuse their power, and to govern by the ignoble method of compulsion, disregarding all appeals to reason and to morality. Hence the need of a combination of moral forces to exercise a constant check upon the hardness with which they are so apt to use their authority. And this leads us to the second of the two great functions of humanity. This function is analogous to that of innervation in individuals. Its object is the advancement of humanity, whether in physical or still more in intellectual and moral aspects. It might seem at first sight restricted, as in lower organisms, to the secondary office of assisting the nutritive function. Soon, however, it develops qualities peculiar to itself, qualities on which our highest happiness depends. And thus we might imagine that life was to be entirely given up to the free play of reason, imagination, and feeling. Were we not constantly forced back by the necessities of our physical nature to less delightful occupations? Therefore this intellectual and moral function, notwithstanding its eminence, can never be supreme in our nature. Yet independently of its intrinsic charm, it forms our principal means, whether used consciously or otherwise, in controlling the somewhat blind action of the nutritive organs. It is in women, whose function is analogous to that of the affective organs in the individual brain, that we find this modifying influence in its purest and most spontaneous form. But the full value of their influence is not realized until they act in combination with the philosophic class, which, though its direct energy is small, is as indispensable to the collective organism as the speculative functions of the brain are to the individual. Besides these two essential elements of moral power, we find, when humanity reaches her maturity, a third element which completes the constitution of this power and furnishes a basis for its political action. This third element is the working class, whose influence may be regarded as the active function in the innervation of the social organism. It is indeed to the working class that we look for the only possible solution of the great human problem, the victory of social feeling over self-love. Their want of leisure, and their poverty, excludes them from political power, and yet wealth, which is the basis of that power, cannot be produced without them. They are allied to the spiritual power by the similarity of their tastes and of their circumstances. Moreover, they look to it for systematic education, of the importance of which not merely to their happiness, but to their dignity and moral culture, they are deeply conscious. The nature of their occupations, though absorbing so large a portion of their time, yet leaves the mind for the most part free. Finding little in the specialties of their work to interest them, they are the more inclined to rise to general principles, provided always that such principles combine utility with reality. Being less occupied than other classes with considerations of rank and wealth, they are the more disposed to give free play to generous feelings, the value and the charm of which is more strongly impressed on them by their experience of life. As their strength lies in numbers, they have a greater tendency to union than capitalists, who, having in their own hands a power which they are apt to suppose resistless, have no such motive for association. They will give their energetic support to the priesthood in its efforts to control the abuse of the power of wealth, and in every respect they are prepared to accept and enforce its moral influence. Being at once special and general, practical and speculative, and at the same time always animated by strong sympathies, they form an intermediate link between the practical and theoretical powers. Connected with the one by the need of education and counsel, and with the other by the necessities of labor and subsistence. The people represent the activity of the Supreme Being, as women represent its sympathy, and philosophers its intellect. But in the organized action of these three organs of innervation upon the organs of social nutrition, it must be borne in mind that the latter are not to be impeded in their functions. The control exercised is to be of a kind that will ennoble them by setting their importance in its true light. True, we are not to encourage the foolish and immoral pride of modern capitalists, who look upon themselves as the creators and sole arbiters of their material power, the foundations of which are in reality due to the combined action of their predecessors and contemporaries. They ought to be regarded simply as public functionaries, responsible for the administration of capital and the direction of industrial enterprise. But at the same time we must be careful not to underrate the immense value of their function, or in any way obstruct its performance. All this follows at once from the policy of separation of powers. The responsibility under which it is here proposed to place capitalists is purely moral, whereas metaphysicians of the revolutionary school have always been in favor of political coercion. In cases where the rich neglect their duty, the positive priesthood will resort in the first instance to every method of conviction and persuasion that can be suggested by the education which the rich have received in common with other classes. Should this course fail, there remains the resource of pronouncing formal condemnation of their conduct. And supposing this to be ratified by the working men of every city, and the women of every family, its effect would be difficult to withstand. In very heinous cases it might be necessary to proceed to the extreme length of social excommunication, the efficacy of which, in cases where it deserved and received general assent, would be even greater than in the Middle Ages. The organization of the spiritual power in those times being very imperfect, But even in this case the means used for repression are of a purely moral kind. The increasingly rare cases that call for political measures belong exclusively to the province of the temporal power. Hereditary transmission of wealth has been strongly condemned by metaphysical writers. But it is after all a natural mode of transmission, and the moral discipline above described will be a sufficient check upon its worst abuses. When the sense of duty is substituted for the sense of right, it matters little who may be the possessor of any given power, provided it be well used. Inheritance, as positivism shows, has great social advantages, especially when applied to functions which require no extraordinary capacity, and which are best learnt in the training of domestic life. Taking the moral point of view, we find that men who have been always accustomed to wealth are more disposed to be generous than those who have amassed it gradually, however honorable the means used. Inheritance was originally the mode in which all functions were transmitted. And in the case of wealth there is no reason why it should not always continue, since the mere preservation of wealth, without reference to its employment, requires but little special ability. There is no guarantee that, if other guardians of capital were appointed, the public would be better served. Modern industry has long ago proved the administrative superiority of private enterprise in commercial transactions. And all social functions that admit of it will gradually pass into private management, always excepting the great theoretic functions in which combined action will ever be necessary. Declaim as the envious will against hereditary wealth, its possessors, when they have a good disposition molded by a wise education and a healthy state of public opinion, will in many cases rank amongst the most useful organs of humanity. It is not the class who constitute the moral force of society that will give vent to these idle complaints. Or at least they will be confined to those individuals among them who fail to understand the dignity and value of their common mission of elevating man's affections, intellect, and energies. The only cases in which the spiritual power has to interfere specially for the protection of material interests fall under two principles, which are very plainly indicated by the natural order of society. The first principle is, that man should support woman, the second, that the active class should support the speculative class. The necessity of both these conditions is evident. Without them the effective and speculative function of humanity cannot be adequately performed. Private and public welfare are so deeply involved in the influence exercised by feeling over the intellectual and active powers, that we shall do well to secure that influence, even at the cost of removing 1/2 of the race from industrial occupations. Even in the lowest tribes of savages we find the stronger sex recognizing some obligations towards the weaker. And it is this which distinguishes human love, even in its coarser forms, from animal appetite. With every step in the progress of humanity we find the obligation more distinctly acknowledged, and more fully satisfied. In positive religion it becomes a fundamental duty, for which each individual, or even society, when it may be necessary, will be held responsible. As to the second principle, it is one which has been already admitted by former systems. And, in spite of the anarchy in which we live, it has never been wholly discarded, at least in countries which have been unaffected by the individualist tendencies of Protestantism. Positivism, however, while adopting the principle as indispensable to the theoretic functions of humanity, will employ it far more sparingly than Catholicism, the decay of which was very much hastened by its excessive wealth. If temporal and spiritual power are really to be separated, philosophers should have as little to do with wealth as with government. Resembling women in their exclusion from political power, their position as to wealth should be like that of the working classes, proper regard being had to the requirements of their office. By following this course, they may be confident that the purity of their opinions and advice will never be called in question. These two conditions then, capitalists, as the normal administrators of the common fund of wealth, will be expected to satisfy. They must, that is, so regulate the distribution of wages, that women shall be released from work, and they must see that proper remuneration is given for intellectual labor. To exact the performance of these conditions seems no easy task, yet until they are satisfied, the equilibrium of our social economy will remain unstable. the institution of property can be maintained no longer upon the untenable ground of personal right. Its present possessors may probably decline to accept these principles. In that case their functions will pass in one way or another to new organs, until humanity finds servants who will not shirk their fundamental duties, but who will recognize them as the first condition of their tenure of power. That power, subject to these limitations, will then be regarded with the highest respect, for all will feel that the existence of humanity depends on it. Alike on intellectual and on moral grounds, society will repudiate the envious passions and subversive views which are aroused at present by the unfounded claims of property, and by its repudiation, since the Middle Ages, of every real moral obligation. Rich men will feel that principles like these, leaving as they do so large a margin of voluntary action to the individual, are the only method of escaping from the political oppression with which they are now threatened. The free concentration of capital will then be readily accepted as necessary to its social usefulness, for great duties imply great powers. This, then, is the way in which the priests of humanity may hope to regenerate the material power of wealth, and bring the nutritive functions of society into harmony with the other parts of the body politic. The contests for which as yet there are but too many motives will then cease. The people without loss of dignity will give free play to their natural instincts of respect, and will be as willing to accept the authority of their political rulers as to place confidence in their spiritual guides. They will feel that true happiness has no necessary connection with wealth, that it depends far more on free play being given to their intellectual, moral, and social qualities, and that in this respect they are more favorably situated than those above them. They will cease to aspire to the enjoyments of wealth and power, leaving them to those whose political activity requires that strong stimulus. Each man's ambition will be to do his work well, and after it is over, to perform his more general function of assisting the spiritual power, and of taking part in the formation of public opinion, by giving his best judgment upon passing events. Of the limits to be observed by the spiritual power the people will be well aware, and they will accept none which does not subordinate the intellect to the heart, and guarantee the purity of its doctrine by strict abstinence from political power. By an appeal to the principles of positive polity, they will at once check any foolish yielding on the part of philosophers to political ambition, and will restore the temporal power to its proper place. They will be aware that though the general principles of practical life rest upon science, it is not for science to direct their application. The incapacity of theorists to apply their theories practically has long been recognized in minor matters, and it will now be recognized as equally applicable to political questions. The province of the philosopher is education, and as the result of education, counsel. The province of the capitalist is action and authoritative direction. This is the only right distribution of power, and the people will insist on maintaining it in its integrity, seeing, as they will, that without it the harmonious existence of humanity is impossible. From this view of the practical side of the religion of humanity taken in connection with its intellectual and moral side, we may form a general conception of the final reorganization of political institutions, by which alone the great revolution can be brought to a close. But the time for effecting this reconstruction has not yet come. There must be a previous reconstruction of opinions and habits of life upon the basis laid down by positivism. And for this at least one generation is required. In the interval all political measures must retain their provisional character, although in framing them the final state is always to be taken into account. As yet nothing can be said to have been established, except the moral principle on which positivism rests, the subordination of politics to morals. For this is in fact implicitly involved in the proclamation of a republic in France. A step which cannot now be recalled, and which implies that each citizen is to devote all his faculties to the service of humanity. But with regard to the social organization, by which alone this principle can be carried into effect, although its basis has been laid down by positivism, it has not yet received the sanction of the public. It may be hoped, however, that the motto which I have put forward as descriptive of the new political philosophy, order and progress, will soon be adopted spontaneously. In the first or negative phase of the revolution, all that was done was utterly to repudiate the old political system. No indication whatever was given of the state of things which was to succeed it. The motto of the time, liberty and equality, is an exact representation of this state of things, the conditions expressed in it being utterly contradictory and incompatible with organization of any kind. For obviously, liberty gives free scope to superiority of all kinds, and especially to moral and mental superiority. So that if a uniform level of equality is insisted on, freedom of growth is checked. Yet inconsistent as the motto was, it was admirably adapted to the destructive temper of the time. A time when hatred of the past compensated the lack of insight into the future. It had, too, a progressive tendency, which partly neutralized its subversive spirit. It inspired the first attempt to derive true principles of polity from general views of history, the memorable though unsuccessful essay of my great predecessor Condorcet. 14 Thus the first intimation of the future influence of the historical spirit was given at the very time when the anti-historical spirit had reached its climax. The long period of reaction which succeeded the first crisis gave rise to no political motto of any importance. It was a period for which men of any vigor of thought and character could not but feel secret repugnance. It produced, however, a universal conviction that the metaphysical policy of the revolutionists was of no avail for constructive purposes. And it gave rise to the historical works of the Neo-Catholic school, which prepared the way for positivism by giving the first fair appreciation of the Middle Ages. But the counter-revolution, begun by Robespierre, carried to its full length by Bonaparte, and continued by the Bourbons, came to an end in the memorable outbreak of 1830. A neutral period of 18 years followed, and a new motto, liberty and public order, was temporarily adopted. This motto was very expressive of the political condition of the time. And the more so that it arose spontaneously, without ever receiving any formal sanction. It expressed the general feeling of the public, who, feeling that the secret of the political future was possessed by none of the existing parties, contented itself with pointing out the two conditions essential as a preparation for it. It was an improvement on the first motto, because it indicated more clearly that the ultimate purpose of the revolution was construction. It got rid of the antisocial notion of equality. All the moral advantages of equality without its political danger existed already in the feeling of fraternity, which, since the Middle Ages, has become sufficiently diffused in Western Europe to need no special formula. Again, this motto introduced empirically the great conception of order, understanding it of course in the limited sense of material order at home and abroad. No deeper meaning was likely to be attached to the word in a time of such mental and moral anarchy. But with the adoption of the Republican principle in 1848-15 the utility of this provisional motto ceased. For the revolution now entered upon its positive phase, which indeed, for all philosophical minds, had been already inaugurated by my discovery of the laws of social science. But the fact of its having fallen into disuse is no reason for going back to the old motto, liberty and equality, which, since the crisis of 1789, has ceased to be appropriate. In the utter absence of social convictions, it has obtained a sort of official resuscitation. But this will not prevent men of good sense and right feeling from adopting spontaneously the motto order and progress, as the principle of all political action for the future. In the second chapter one dwelt at some length upon this motto, and pointed out its political and philosophical meaning. I have now only to show its connection with the other mottos of which we have been speaking, and the probability of its adoption. Each of them, like all combinations, whether in the moral or physical world, is composed of two elements. And the last has one of its elements in common with the second, as the second has in common with the first. Moreover, liberty, the element common to the two first, is in reality contained in the third, since all progress implies liberty. But order is put foremost, because the word is here intended to cover the whole field that properly belongs to it. It includes things private as well as public, theoretical as well as practical, moral as well as political. Progress is put next, as the end for which order exists, and as the mode in which it should be manifested. This conception, for which the crisis of 1789 prepared the way, will be our guiding principle throughout the constructive phase of the Western Revolution. The reconciliation of order and progress, which had hitherto been impossible, is now an accepted fact for all advanced minds. For the public this is not yet the case. But since the close of the counter-revolution in 1830, all minds have been tending unconsciously in this direction. The tendency becomes still more striking by contrast with an opposite movement, the increasing identity of principles between the reactionary and the anarchist schools. But even if we suppose accomplished what is yet only in prospect, even if the fundamental principle of our future polity were accepted and publicly ratified by the adoption of this motto, yet permanent reconstruction of political institutions would still be premature. Before this can be attempted, the spiritual interregnum must be terminated. For this object, in which all hearts and minds, especially among the working classes and among women, must unite their efforts with those of the philosophic priesthood, at least one generation is required. During this period governmental policy should be avowedly provisional, its one object should be to maintain what is so essential to our state of transition, order, at home and abroad. Here, too, positivism suffices for the task. By explaining on historical principles the stage that we have left, and that at which we shall ultimately arrive, it enables us to understand the character of the intermediate stage. The solution of the problem consists in a new revolutionary government, adapted to the positive phase of the revolution, as the admirable institutions of the convention were to its negative phase. The principal features of such a government would be perfect freedom of speech and discussion, and at the same time political preponderance of the central authority with proper guarantees for its purity. To secure perfect freedom of discussion, various measures would be taken. All penalties and fines which at present hamper its action would be abolished, the only check left being the obligation of signature. Again, all difficulties in the way of criticizing the private character of public men, due to the disgraceful legislation of the psychologists, would be removed. Lastly, all official grants to theological and metaphysical institutions would be discontinued, for while these remain, freedom of instruction in the true sense cannot be said to exist. With such substantial guarantees there will be little fear of reactionary tendencies on the part of the executive, and consequently no danger in allowing it to take that ascendancy over the electoral body which, in the present state of mental and moral anarchy, is absolutely necessary for the maintenance of material order. On this plan the French Assembly would be reduced to about 200 members. And its duty only would be to vote the budget proposed by the Finance Committee of Government, and to audit the accounts of the past year. All executive or legislative measures would come within the province of the central power, the only condition being that they should first be submitted to free discussion, whether by journals, public meetings, or individual thinkers. Though such discussion should not bind the government legally. The progressive character of the government thus guaranteed, we have next to see that the men who compose it shall be such as are likely to carry out the provisional and purely practical purpose with which it is instituted. On positive principles, it is to the working classes that we should look for the only statesman worthy of succeeding to the statesman of the convention. 3 of such men would be required for the central government. They would combine the functions of a ministry with those of monarchy, one of them taking the direction of foreign affairs, another of home affairs, the third of finance. They would convoke and dissolve the electoral power on their own responsibility. Of this body the majority would in a short time, without any law to that effect, consist of the larger capitalists. For the office would be gratuitous, and the duties would be of a kind for which their ordinary avocations fitted them. Changes would occasionally be necessary in the central government. But since it would consist of 3 persons, its continuity might be maintained, and the traditions of the previous generation, as well as the tendencies of the future, and the position actually existing, might all be represented. Such a government, though of course retaining some revolutionary features, would come as near to the normal state as is at present practicable. For its province would be entirely limited to material questions, and the only anomaly of importance would be the fact of choosing rulers from the working classes. Normally, this class is excluded from political administration, which falls ultimately into the hands of capitalists. But the anomaly is so obviously dependent simply on the present condition of affairs, and will be so restricted in its application, that the working classes are not likely to be seriously demoralized by it. The primary object being to infuse morality into practical life, it is clear that working men, whose minds and hearts are peculiarly accessible to moral influence, are for the present best qualified for political power. No check meantime is placed on the action of the capitalists. And this provisional policy prepares the way for their ultimate accession to power, by convincing them of the urgent need of private and public regeneration, without which they can never be worthy of it. By this course, too, it becomes easier to bring the consultative influence of a spiritual power to bear upon modern government. At first such influence can only be exercised spontaneously. But it will become more and more systematic with every new step in the great philosophical renovation on which the final reorganization of society is based. The propriety of the provisional policy here recommended is further illustrated by the wide scope of its application. Although suggested by the difficulties peculiar to the position of France, it is equally adapted to other nations who are sufficiently advanced to take part in the great revolutionary crisis. Thus the second phase of the revolution is at once distinguished from the first, by having an occidental, as opposed to a purely national, character. And the fact of the executive government being composed of working men, points in the same direction. Since of all classes working men are the most free from local prejudices, and have the strongest tendencies, both intellectually and morally, to universal union. Even should this form of government be limited for some years to France, it would be enough to remodel the old system of diplomacy throughout the West. Such are the advantages which the second revolutionary government will derive from the possession of systematic principles. Whereas the government of the Convention was left to its empirical instincts, and had nothing but its progressive instincts to guide it. A special report was published in 1848 by the Positivist Society, 16, in which the subject of provisional government will be found discussed in greater detail. Quiet at home and peace abroad being secured, we shall be able, notwithstanding the continuance of mental and moral anarchy, to proceed actively with the vast work of social regeneration, with the certainty of full liberty of thought and expression. For this purpose it will be desirable to institute the philosophical and political association to which I alluded in the last volume of my Positive Philosophy, published in 1842, under the title of Positive Occidental Committee. 17 its sittings would usually be held in Paris, and it would consist, in the first place, of 8 Frenchmen, 7 Englishmen, 6 Germans, 5 Italians, and 4 Spaniards. This would be enough to represent fairly the principal divisions of each population. Germany, for instance, might send a Dutchman, a Prussian, a Swede, a Dane, a Bavarian, and an Austrian. So, too, the Italian members might come respectively from Piedmont, Lombardy, Tuscany, the Roman states, and the 2 Sicilies. Again, Catalonia, Castile, Andalusia, and Portugal would adequately represent the Spanish peninsula. Thus we should have a sort of permanent council of the new church. Each of the 3 elements of the moderating power should be admitted into it. And it might also contain such members of the governing class as were sufficiently regenerated to be of use in forwarding the general movement. There should be practical men in this council as well as philosophers. Here, as elsewhere, it will be principally from the working classes that such practical cooperation will come. But no support, if given sincerely, will be rejected, even should it emanate from the classes who are destined to extinction. It is also most important for the purposes of this council that the third element of the moderating power, women, should be included in it, so as to represent the fundamental principle of the preponderance of the heart over the understanding. 6 ladies should be chosen in addition to the 30 members above mentioned. Of these, 2 would be French, and 1 from each of the other nations. Besides their ordinary sphere of influence, it will be their special duty to disseminate positivism among our Southern brethren. It is an office that I had reserved for my saintly colleague, who, but for her premature death, would have rendered eminent service in such a council. While material order is maintained by national governments, the members of the council, as pioneers of the final order of society, will be carrying on the European movement, and gradually terminating the spiritual interregnum which is now the sole obstacle to social regeneration. They will forward the development and diffusion of positivism, and make practical application of its principles, in all ways that are honorably open to them. Instruction of all kinds, oral or written, popular or philosophic, will fall within their province, but their chief aim will be to inaugurate the worship of humanity so far as that is possible. And already a beginning is possible, so far at least as the system of commemoration is concerned. Politically they may give a direct proof of the international character of the positive system, by bringing forward several measures, the utility of which has long been recognized, but which have been neglected for want of some central authority placed beyond the reach of national rivalry. One of the most important of such measures would be the establishment of a Western naval force, with the twofold object of protecting the seas, and of assisting geographical and scientific discovery. It should be recruited and supported by all 5 branches of the Occidental family, and would thus be a good substitute for the admirable institution of maritime chivalry which fell with Catholicism. On its flag the positivist motto would naturally be inscribed, and thus would be for the first time publicly recognized. Another measure, conceived in the same spirit, would soon follow, one which has long been desired, but which, owing to the anarchy prevalent throughout the West since the decline of Catholicism, has never yet been carried out. A common monetary standard will be established, with the consent of the various governments, by which industrial transactions will be greatly facilitated. 3 spheres made respectively of gold, silver, and platinum, and each weighing 50 grams, would differ sufficiently in value for the purpose. The sphere should have a small flattened base, and on the great circle parallel to it the positivist motto would be inscribed. At the pole would be the image of the immortal Charlemagne, the founder of the Western Republic, and round the image his name would be engraved, in its Latin form, Carolus. That name, respected as it is by all nations of Europe alike, would be the common appellation of the universal monetary standard. The adoption of such measures would soon bring the Positivist Committee into favor. Many others might be suggested, relating directly to its fundamental purpose, which need not be specially mentioned here. I will only suggest the foundation, by voluntary effort, of an Occidental school, to serve as the nucleus of a true philosophic class. The students would ultimately enter the positivist priesthood. They would in most instances come from the working class, without, however, excluding real talent from whatever quarter. By their agency the septennial course of positive teaching might be introduced in all places disposed to receive it. They would besides supply voluntary missionaries, who would preach the doctrine everywhere, even outside the limits of Western Europe, according to the plan hereafter to be explained. The travels of positivist workmen in the ordinary duties of their calling, would greatly facilitate this work. A more detailed view of this provisional system of instruction will be found in the 2nd edition of the Report on the Subject of a Positive School, published by the Positivist Society in 1849. 18. There is another step which might be taken, relating not merely to the period of transition, but also to the normal state. A flag suitable to the Western Republic might be adopted, which, with slight alterations, would also be the flag for each nation. The want of such a symbol is already instinctively felt. What is wanted is a substitute for the old retrograde symbols, which yet shall avoid all subversive tendencies. It would be a suitable inauguration of the period of transition which we are now entering, if the colors and mottos appropriate to the final state were adopted at its outset. To speak first of the banner to be used in religious services. It should be painted on canvas. On one side the ground would be white. On it would be the symbol of humanity, personified by a woman of 30 years of age, bearing her son in her arms. The other side would bear the religious formula of positivists: love is our principle, order is our basis, progress our end, upon a ground of green, the color of hope. And therefore most suitable for emblems of the future. Green, too, would be the color of the political flag, common to the whole West. As it is intended to float freely, it does not admit of painting. But the carved image of humanity might be placed at the banner pole. The principal motto of positivism will, in this case, be divided into two, both alike significant. One side of the flag will have the political and scientific motto, order and progress, the other, the moral and aesthetic motto, live for others. The first will be preferred by men. The other is more especially adapted to women, who are thus invited to participate in these public manifestations of social feeling. This point settled, the question of the various national flags becomes easy. In these the center might be green, and the national colors might be displayed on the border. Thus, in France, where the innovation will be first introduced, the border would be tricolor, with the present arrangement of colors, except that more space should be given to the white. In honor of our old royal flag. In this way uniformity would be combined with variety, and, moreover, it would be shown that the new feeling of Occidentality is perfectly compatible with respect for the smallest nationalities. Each would retain the old signs in combination with the common symbol. The same principle would apply to all emblems of minor importance. The question of these symbols, of which I have spoken during the last 2 years in my weekly courses of lectures, illustrates the most immediate of the functions to which the Positive Committee will be called. I mention it here, as a type of its general action upon European society. Without setting any limits to the gradual increase of the association, it is desirable that the central nucleus should always remain limited to the original number of 36, with 2 additions, which will shortly be mentioned. Each member might institute a more numerous association in his own country, and this again might be the parent of others. Associations thus affiliated may be developed to an unlimited extent. And thus we shall be able to maintain the unity and homogeneity of the positive church, without impairing its coherence and vigor. As soon as positivism has gained in every country a sufficient number of voluntary adherents to constitute the preponderating section of the community, the regeneration of society is secured. The numbers assigned above for the different nations only represent the order in which the advanced minds in each will cooperate in the movement. The order in which the great body of each nation will join it, will be, as far as we can judge from their antecedents, somewhat different. The difference is, that Italy here takes the second place, and Spain the third, while England descends to the last. The grounds for this important modification are indicated in the 3rd edition of my positive calendar. They will be discussed in detail in the 4th volume of this treatise. 19. From Europe the movement will spread ultimately to the whole race. But the first step in its progress will naturally be to the inhabitants of our colonies, who, though politically independent of Western Europe, still retain their filiation with it. 12 colonial members may be added to the Council, 4 for each American continent, 2 for India, 2 for the Dutch and Spanish possessions in the Indian Ocean. This gives us 48 members. To these 12 foreign associates will gradually be added, to represent the populations whose growth has been retarded. And then the Council will have received its full complement. For every nation of the world is destined for the same ultimate conditions of social regeneration as ourselves, the only difference being that Western Europe, under the leadership of France, takes the initiative. It is of great importance not to attempt this final extension too soon, an error which would impair the precision and vigor of the renovating movement. At the same time it must never be forgotten that the existence of the great being remains incomplete until all its members are brought into harmonious cooperation. In ancient times social sympathy was restricted to the idea of nationality. Between this and the final conception of humanity, the Middle Ages introduced the intermediate conception of Christendom or Occidentality, the real bearing of which is at present but little appreciated. It will be our first political duty to revive that conception, and place it on a firmer basis, by terminating the anarchy consequent on the extinction of Catholic feudalism. While occupied in this task, we shall become impressed with the conviction that the union of Western Europe is but a preliminary step to the union of humanity. An instinctive presentiment of which has existed from the infancy of our race, but which as long as theological belief and military life were predominant, could never be carried out even in thought. The primary laws of human development which form the philosophical basis of the positive system, apply necessarily to all climates and races whatsoever. The only difference being in the rapidity with which evolution takes place. The inferiority of other nations in this respect is not inexplicable, and it will now be compensated by a growth of greater regularity than ours, and less interrupted by shocks and oscillations. Obviously in our case systematic guidance was impossible, since it is only now that our growth is complete that we can learn the general laws common to it and to other cases. Wise and generous intervention of the West on behalf of our sister nations who are less advanced, will form a noble field for social art, when based on sound scientific principles. Relative without being arbitrary, zealous and yet always temperate, such should be the spirit of this intervention. And thus conducted, it will form a system of moral and political action far nobler than the proselytism of theology or the extension of military empire. The time will come when it will engross the whole attention of the Positive Council, but for the present it must remain secondary to other subjects of greater urgency. The first to join the Western movement will necessarily be the remaining portion of the white race, which in all its branches is superior to the other two races. There are two monotheist nations, and one polytheist, which will be successively incorporated. Taken together, the three represent the propagation of positivism in the East. The vast population of the Russian Empire was left outside the pale of Catholic feudalism. By virtue of its Christianity, however, notwithstanding its entire confusion of temporal and spiritual power, it holds the first place among the monotheistic nations of the East. Its initiation into the Western movement will be conducted by two nations of intermediate position, Greece, connected with Russia by the tie of religion, and Poland, united with her politically. Though neither of these nations is homogeneous in structure with Russia, it would cause serious delay in the propagation of positivism should the connection be altogether terminated. The next step will be to Mohammedan monotheism, first in Turkey, afterwards in Persia. Here positivism will find points of sympathy of which Catholicism could not admit. Indeed, these are already perceptible. Arab civilization transmitted Greek science to us, and this will always secure for it an honorable place among the essential elements of the medieval system, regarded as a preparation for positivism. Lastly, we come to the polytheists of India, and with them the incorporation of the white race will be complete. Already we see some spontaneous tendencies in this direction. Although from exceptional causes theocracy has been preserved in India, there exist real points of contact with positivism, and in this respect the assistance of Persia will be of service. It is the peculiar privilege of the positive doctrine that, taking so complete a view of human development, it is always able to appreciate the most ancient forms of social life at their true worth. In these three stages of positivist propagation, the Council will have elected the first half of its foreign associates. Admitting successively a Greek, a Russian, an Egyptian, a Turk, a Persian and finally, a Hindu. The yellow race has adhered firmly to polytheism. But it has been considerably modified in all its branches by monotheism, either in the Christian or Mohammedan form. To some extent, therefore, it is prepared for further change. And a sufficient number of adherents may soon be obtained for Tartary, China, Japan, and Malacca to be represented in the Council. With one last addition, the organization of the Council is complete. The black race has yet to be included. It should send two representatives. One from Haiti, which had the energy to shake off the iniquitous yoke of slavery, and the other from Central Africa, which has never yet been subjected to European influence. European pride has looked with contempt on these African tribes, and imagines them destined to hopeless stagnation. But the very fact of their having been left to themselves renders them better disposed to receive positivism, the first system in which their fetishistic faith has been appreciated, as the origin from which the historic evolution of society has proceeded. It is probable that the Council will have reached its limit of 60 members, before the spiritual interregnum in the central region of humanity has been terminated. But even if political reconstruction were to proceed so rapidly in Europe as to render all possible assistance to this vast movement, it is hardly conceivable that the 5 stages of which it consists can be thoroughly effected within a period of 2 centuries. But however this may be, the action of the Council will become increasingly valuable, not only for its direct influence on the less advanced nations, but also and more especially because the proofs it will furnish of the universality of the new religion will strengthen its adherents in the Western family. But the time when positivism can be brought into direct contact with these preliminary phases is far distant, and we need not wait for it. The features of the system stand out already with sufficient clearness to enable us to begin at once the work of mental and social renovation for which our revolutionary predecessors so energetically prepared the way. They, however, were blinded to the future by their hatred of the past. With us, on the contrary, social sympathy rests upon the historical spirit, and at the same time strengthens it. Solidarity with our contemporaries is not enough for us, unless we combine it with the sense of continuity with former times. And while we press on toward the future, we lean upon the past, every phase of which our religion holds in honor. So far from the energy of our progressive movement being hampered by such feelings, it is only by doing full justice to the past, as no system but ours can do consistently, that we can obtain perfect emancipation of thought. Because we are thus saved from the necessity of making the slightest actual concession to systems which we regard as obsolete. Understanding their nature and their purpose better than the sectaries who still empirically adhere to them, we can see that each was in its time necessary as a preparatory step towards the final system, in which all their partial and imperfect services will be combined. Comparing it especially with the last synthesis by which the Western family of nations has been directed, it is clear even from the indications given in this prefatory work, that the new synthesis is more real, more comprehensive, and more stable. All that we find to admire in the medieval system is developed and matured in positivism. It is the only system which can induce the intellect to accept its due position of subordination to the heart. We recognize the piety and chivalry of our ancestors, who made a noble application of the best doctrine that was possible in their time. We believe that were they living now, they would be found in our ranks. They would acknowledge the decay of their provisional phase of thought, and would see that in its present degenerate state it is only a symbol of reaction, and a source of discord. And now that the doctrine has been shown to rest on a central principle, a principle which appeals alike to instinct and to reason, we may carry our comparison a step further, and convince all clear-seeing and honest minds that it is as superior to former systems in its influence over the emotions and the imagination, as it is from the practical and intellectual aspect. Under it, life, whether private or public, becomes in a still higher sense than under polytheism, a continuous act of worship performed under the inspiration of universal love. All our thoughts, feelings, and actions flow spontaneously to a common center in humanity, our supreme being. A being who is real, accessible, and sympathetic, because she is of the same nature as her worshippers, though far superior to any one of them. The very conception of humanity is a condensation of the whole mental and social history of man. For it implies the irrevocable extinction of theology and of war, both of which are incompatible with uniformity of belief and with cooperation of all the energies of the race. The spontaneous morality of the emotions is restored to its due place, and philosophy, poetry, and polity are thereby regenerated. Each is placed in its due relation to the others, and is consecrated to the study, the praise, and the service of humanity, the most relative and the most perfectible of all beings. Science passes from the analytic to the synthetic state, being entrusted with the high mission of founding an objective basis for man's action on the laws of the external world and of man's nature. A basis which is indispensable to control the oscillation of our opinions, the versatility of our feelings, and the instability of our purposes. Poetry assumes at last its true social function, and will henceforth be preferred to all other studies. By idealizing humanity under every aspect, it enables us to give fit expression to the gratitude we owe to her, both publicly and as individuals. And thus it becomes a source of the highest spiritual benefit. But amidst the pleasures that spring from the study and the praise of humanity, it must be remembered that positivism is characterized always by reality and utility, and admits of no degeneration into asceticism or quietism. The love by which it is inspired is no passive principle. While stimulating reason and imagination, it does so only to give a higher direction to our practical activity. It was in practical life that the positive spirit first arose, extending thence to the sphere of thought, and ultimately to the moral sphere. The grand object of human existence is the constant improvement of the natural order that surrounds us, of our material condition first, subsequently of our physical, intellectual, and moral nature. And the highest of these objects is moral progress, whether in the individual, in the family, or in society. It is on this that human happiness, whether in private or public life, principally depends. Political art, then, when subordinated to morality, becomes the most essential of all arts. It consists in concentration of all human effort upon the service of humanity in accordance with the natural laws which regulate her existence. The great merit of ancient systems of polity, of the Roman system especially, was that precedence was always given to public interests. Every citizen cooperated in the manner and degree suited to those early times. But there were no means of providing proper regulation for domestic life. In the Middle Ages, when Catholicism attempted to form a complete system of morality, private life was made the principal object. All our affections were subjected to a most beneficial course of discipline, in which the inmost springs of vice and virtue were reached. But owing to the inadequacy of the doctrines on which the system rested, the solution of the problem was incoherent. The method by which Catholicism controlled the selfish propensities was one which turned men away from public life, and concentrated them on interests which were at once chimerical and personal. The immediate value of this great effort was, that it brought about for the first time a separation between moral and political power, which in the systems of antiquity had always been confounded. But the separation was due rather to the force of circumstances than to any conscious efforts. And it could not be fully carried out, because it was incompatible with the spirit of the Catholic doctrine and with the military character of society. Woman sympathized with Catholicism, but the people never supported it with enthusiasm, and it soon sank under the encroachments of the temporal power, and the degeneracy of the priesthood. Positivism is the only system which can renew this premature effort and bring it to a satisfactory issue. Combining the spirit of antiquity with that of Catholic feudalism, it proposes to carry out the political program put forward by the Convention. Positive religion brings before us in a definite shape the noblest of human problems, the permanent preponderance of social feeling over self-love. As far as the exceeding imperfection of our nature enables us to solve it, it would be solved by calling our home affections into continuous action. Affections which stand halfway between self-love and universal sympathy. In order to consolidate and develop this solution, positivism lays down the philosophical and social principle of separation of theoretical from practical power. Theoretical power is consultative. It directs education and supplies general principles. Practical power directs action by special and imperative rules. All the elements of society that are excluded from political government become guarantees for the preservation of this arrangement. The priests of humanity, who are the systematic organs of the moderating power, will always find themselves supported, in their attempts to modify the governing power, by women and by the people. But to be so supported, they must be men who, in addition to the intellectual power necessary for their mission, have the moral qualities which are yet more necessary. Who combine, that is, the tenderness of women with the energy of the people. The first guarantee for the possession of such qualities is the sacrifice of political authority and even of wealth. Then we may at least hope to see the new religion taking the place of the old, because it will fulfill in a more perfect way the mental and social purposes for which the old religion existed. Monotheism will lapse like polytheism and fetishism, into the domain of history. And will, like them, be incorporated into the system of universal commemoration, in which humanity will render due homage to all her predecessors. It is not, then, merely on the ground of speculative truth that positivists would urge all those who are still halting between two opinions, to choose between the absolute and the relative. Between the fruitless search for causes and the solid study of laws, between submission to arbitrary wills and submission to demonstrable necessities. It is for feeling still more than for reason to make the decision, for upon it depends the establishment of a higher form of social life. Monotheism in Western Europe is now as obsolete and as injurious as polytheism was 15 centuries ago. The discipline in which its moral value principally consisted has long since decayed. And consequently the sole effect of its doctrine, which has been so extravagantly praised, is to degrade the affections by unlimited desires, and to weaken the character by servile terrors. It supplied no field for the imagination, and forced it back upon polytheism and fetishism, which, under theology, form the only possible foundation for poetry. The pursuits of practical life were never sincerely promoted by it, and they advanced only by evading or resisting its influence. The noblest of all practical pursuits, that of social regeneration, is at the present time in direct opposition to it. For by its vague notion of providence, it prevents men from forming a true conception of law, a conception necessary for true provision, on which all-wise intervention must be based. Sincere believers in Christianity will soon cease to interfere with the management of a world, where they profess themselves to be pilgrims and strangers. The new Supreme Being is no less jealous than the old, and will not accept the servants of two masters. But the truth is, that the more zealous theological partisans, whether royalists, or aristocrats, or democrats, have now for a long time been insincere. God to them is but the nominal chief of a hypocritical conspiracy, a conspiracy which is even more contemptible than it is odious. Their object is to keep the people from all great social improvements by assuring them that they will find compensation for their miseries in an imaginary future life. The doctrine is already falling into discredit among the working classes everywhere throughout the West, especially in Paris. All theological tendencies, whether Catholic, Protestant, or deist, really serve to prolong and aggravate our moral anarchy. Because they hinder the diffusion of that social sympathy and breadth of view, without which we can never attain fixity of principle and regularity of life. Every subversive scheme now afloat has either originated in monotheism or has received its sanction. Even Catholicism has lost its power of controlling revolutionary extravagance in some of its own most distinguished members. It is for the sake of order therefore, even more than of progress, that we call on all those who desire to rise above their present disastrous state of oscillation in feeling and opinion, to make a distinct choice between positivism and theology. For there are now but two camps, the camp of reaction and anarchy, which acknowledges more or less distinctly the direction of God, the camp of construction and progress, which is wholly devoted to humanity. The being upon whom all our thoughts are concentrated is one whose existence is undoubted. We recognize that existence not in the present only, but in the past, and even in the future, and we find it always subject to one fundamental law, by which we are enabled to conceive of it as a whole. Placing our highest happiness in universal love, we live, as far as it is possible, for others, and this in public life as well as in private, for the two are closely linked together in our religion. A religion clothed in all the beauty of art, and yet never inconsistent with science. After having thus exercised our powers to the full, and having given a charm and sacredness to our temporary life, we shall at last be forever incorporated into the Supreme Being, of whose life all noble natures are necessarily partakers. It is only through the workers of humanity that we can feel the inward reality and inexpressible sweetness of this incorporation. It is unknown to those who being still involved in theological belief, have not been able to form a clear conception of the future, and have never experienced the feeling of pure self-sacrifice.